evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the March 18th meeting of the Advisory Committee. Thank you all for coming out. Nice to have a big crowd. We don't usually have that. Whenever we meet, I'm Donna Smallwood, I'm the chair. Whenever we meet, we set aside time at the beginning of the meeting for members of the public that might want to comment on something that is not on the agenda. Does anyone wish to speak to something that is not on the agenda? There are other boards here that... Is this better? Is that better? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I neglected to recognize that there are other committee members that need to call to order. Go ahead.
Call to order the 18 March 2019 meeting of the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee. Call to order the Board of Selectmen meeting.
Everybody called to order that needs to be? Okay, and I don't think there was anybody who indicated they wished to speak to something that was not on the agenda. So we'll move right ahead. We have minutes listed on our agenda, which we are going to defer. I know that saddens everybody in the room. The first item that we are going to address is to consider a reserve fund transfer for the Harbormaster. Chief and Ken, you want to tell us what's going on here?
Yes. Yes, we do. Yeah. Good.
Good evening. Thank you for having us on this busy night. We'll try to be as brief as we can. Last, I think it was early February, end of January, the Harbormaster truck was parked off the street, unoccupied, and it was hit by another vehicle pulling a trailer and an excavator. During this incident, the truck was smushed up against a tree, spun around 45 degrees, and sustained significant damage. It was subsequently totaled by the insurance company. The insurance company has said that they'll give us $22,000 in insurance funds for the truck. As before you have the quote on a replacement vehicle. It's not just the vehicle, but it's the vehicle with, if we have to put all new equipment onto the vehicle, that's what the price would be. The truck is currently at the dealership. They're going to go through all the equipment that's on it, determine what is still able to be transferred, what's out of date and should be replaced. And we'll be able to refine this quote some more, and it should be able to come down significantly, but the quote you have before you is if we have to replace all the equipment that's currently on the truck with today's comparable equipment. So I know it's a big price tag, and I'm confident that over the next couple of weeks we're going to be able to bring that down significantly, but like I said, this is if we have to replace all the equipment that's on the truck.
I think one of the other things too, in talking with the insurance companies, there'll also be a transfer, additional funds, but they won't quote us that because it depends on the transfer, but they said it would be anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000. So the total value we'll be receiving from the insurance company is going to be closer to $30,000.
So my understanding is the reason we're looking at this now is the truck needs to be taken care of before the season starts.
That's correct. It's not in the capital plan, and we need to address it. It's an important piece of equipment for us to get the boats to and from the harbor, set up the harbor. So it's something we need to act on. It was unforeseen and somewhat of an emergency type situation. It's not something that we can go through the capital process to replace.
And any funds that are not needed because we have some equipment we can still use or will come back, as will the insurance proceeds.
That's correct.
Okay. Questions from my colleagues?
So you have 51,000 presently in the account. Is all of that accounted for? I mean, you go.
Yes, that's actually because the Harbormaster's capital outlay falls under the police department's. We're just in the process of finishing up our replacement of our cruisers. That's why there's a $51,000 balance. It's actually probably less than that, I think, soon now, because we paid some bills.
Okay, so that's why you're asking for the entire amount for the truck. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay. Additional questions from my colleagues? May I have a motion? So moved. A second? All those in favor of approving this reserve fund transfer? Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. 14-0. If I sign this, can you?
Just wait for the dismissal.
Thank you.
Three
Okay.
in the house.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sue? Okay. With that, let's move into the heart of our meeting, the consideration of the 4 warrant articles that address issues around the potential acquisition of the water company. Our intent is to hear the articles tonight, to listen to each other on the advisory committee, and to listen to those of you in the audience who have come to share your perspectives with us. And we intend to vote on these articles at our meeting on Wednesday this week. Tonight, we're going to follow our usual advisory committee protocol for these kinds of hearings, which is that the liaison subcommittee for AdCom that has taken the lead in doing the deep research on this will walk us through article by article. We'll do them one at a time. Their work, their perspective, their proposed draft comment and recommended motion. We will then take questions and comments from advisory committee members, and then questions and comments from the audience. When we get to the audience portion of listening to what you have to say this evening, we're going to limit comments to 4 minutes each. I know it's short, but many of us, I think, will want to speak tonight. Julie Straley is going to be our timer and has high-tech construction paper to flag the halfway mark, the 2-minute mark, and the 4-minute please wrap up and sit down mark. So you can watch for her signals. When we get to that part of the meeting, please wait to be recognized, and then we invite you to come up to the microphone. Please give us your name and address. We ask that you address your questions to the chair. In general, I will recognize folks who have not had an opportunity to speak before I recognize someone who has already spoken, so that we get to hear from as many people as possible tonight. So with that, I would like to we're going to address first Article MM. And Victor, would you lead us?
So MM, as I think we're all aware, is the main article on the water company. It proposes acquiring the water company, meaning the water distribution system, the water treatment plant, for approximately $108 million. You heard background last week, so I won't go into too much detail other than to note that the water company was incorporated in 1879 after Is that better? Okay. Okay.
Please continue to do that for us. Thank you.
So the water company was incorporated in 1879. We should need a bigger mic here. By a special act of the legislature. That was after several attempts by residents to have a town water company established that was defeated at town meeting at that time. So the special act provides that Hingham has the right to acquire the water company's business at any time by a 2/3 vote of town meeting. So eventually, through a number of amendments, the water company service area extended from Hingham to Nantasket, then through all of Hull, and then the company was authorized to serve Cohasset as well, and actually Norwell. Today, the company serves Hingham, Hull, and several hundred homes in North Cohasset. So the company was owned locally for many years. But outside corporate ownership came in sort of the mid-20th century. Then in 2002, the company was purchased by a UK, United Kingdom company. In 2007, it was sold to an Australian company, and then in 2017, Eversource bought it, so I guess it's back in the States. Besides the Hingham, Hull, Cohasset area, which is known as Service Area A, and you've probably seen that in some of the documents. The water company, Aquarian, owns operations in Oxford and Millbury. So we're just talking about the Hingham portion of this. The 1879 statute sets a formula for how the price is to be determined. It's not crystal clear, so the town in 2012, when it decided to investigate whether to go ahead with, whether a purchase made sense or not, tried to figure out what the price was. Aquarian and the town could not agree, so the town instituted litigation, and the court came up with a price. One of the questions during that litigation also was whether the water treatment plant, which was built in the mid-1995 or something like that, was included in the purchase. Court decided it was, so if the town goes ahead under this article, the acquisition would include the entire system, including that plant. The court came up with a price and came up with a formula for determining the price on an ongoing basis. So the price is not set for all time. The price moves based on certain factors in the formula, and basically goes up about $3 to $4 million a year. So the proposal that the selectmen are now bringing before the town would be to acquire the company and borrow over 30 years, actually approximately $112 million, so that would cover the purchase price, and it would also cover reimbursement for acquisition costs, including the litigation costs, and it would include $2.7 million of first-year capital. Now, I keep saying approximately because the formula has to come current to town meeting, which would be, if the town decided to go ahead, that would be the day when the price was set. The town, as I understand it, has a figure through the end of 2017, but needs to know what capital investment has been made by Aquarian since that time to actually come up with the exact price. So that's why I keep saying approximately. The funding would be basically general obligation bonds. That means that the town is issuing the bond, not the water system. However, they would be repaid by the water ratepayers, the water rates. So there would be no impact on taxes. It would not be counted against the town's debt limit because, well, there's a statute that actually allows water system type acquisitions to be funded outside of the borrowing limit. The town's financial advisors have been consulted, I guess, quite frequently on this issue, and they have said that this should not affect the credit rating of the town. Again, because there's a dedicated and sufficient revenue stream. We'll talk about this more with other articles, but I'll note that if this were to go ahead, the town would be looking to establish an enterprise fund, meaning that all income, all revenue, and all expenditures for the water system would go through the fund rather than through general town coffers. And another topic that we'll be discussing in more detail in one of the later articles, at least as an initial matter, the Board of Selectmen are proposing that they would be water commissioners. So, we have sewer commissioners for our sewer authority. We have a light board for the light plant. So we would need water commissioners, and the selectmen are proposing to act in that capacity. So the subcommittee, advisory committee subcommittee met, well, I guess we had at least 7 substantive meetings that were not, I say substantive, our own, as opposed to meeting jointly or attending other groups' meetings, and quite a few hours of investigation on this. We spent a lot of time reviewing financial feasibility, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But it's also important, I think, for the proponents, and also the subcommittee considered this as well, that I'll call them perhaps intangibles. other benefits from whatever the financial situation is that could come from local control. So the view of the proponents is that water is a critical resource. So having local control over that makes a lot of sense, rather than relying on a corporation which ownership changes relatively frequently. The focus also of a public ownership would be the ratepayers. There would be no need to also be concerned with shareholders. There'd be a local rate-setting process. Currently, there's a state-based rate-setting process at the Department of Public Utilities. There has been concern that that's not the most accessible forum. It's also can be an expensive forum because both the company and if the towns choose to intervene in those proceedings are incurring a fair bit of costs. If the town were to go ahead, rate setting would be done locally through the normal budget process. Hearings would be local, they'd be public, people could attend more easily than if they had to go into the state to the DPU hearings. Also, local decision-making would be public as opposed to being behind closed corporate doors. There's also proponents believe that there'd be an ability to replace water mains and do other capital projects more quickly than has been the history with private ownership. This will get into some of the discussion on the finances, but to the extent that there are savings with public ownership, some of that money could be directed to capital projects. There's also the view that the town, and this is both Hingham and Hull, road rehabilitation programs could be better coordinated with water repairs and water replacement work. There is some concern that that has not been happening as well as it could have under private ownership. Also, there could be better attention to protection of the aquifer and watershed. Municipalities or public systems can get grants from state and federal sources to buy watershed land, otherwise take steps to protect those resources. Now, opponents naturally have a different view. Some of their concerns are that, hey, we're taking on a long debt burden that's large. Long-term burden, and it is, not insubstantial. They believe that the town may be underestimating the cost of owning the system and actually running it. In particular, there's been discussion about whether the contract operator, and I guess I'll step back. So the proposal is that the town's initial operations would have water commissioners, but they're not going to run things. They're sort of the policy-making body. The town would hire a water superintendent who would be a town employee, and then there would be a contract operator for 3 to 5, some multi-year period. The contract operator would be someone who is, a company that does this professionally, runs water systems, runs water treatment systems, plants. That company would then report to the water superintendent, who also would be a certified licensed person, so would be familiar with running systems of this sort. So the town asked in the fall, I guess, or late summer, for non-binding estimates to get a sense from companies of this sort, to get a sense for what the cost would be to operate. And they received 2 estimates. In the financial analysis, the town took the higher, but there is concern whether that is an accurate estimate or not. So people have raised questions on that and how much leeway is there if that number turns out to be incorrect. Does that throw the financial benefits or analysis to the town out of whack. And so that's one concern. Other concerns are with the Board of Selectmen as water commissioners, and again, we can go into that later. But 2 points are they overburdened? They have enough to do anyway. There's only 3 of them. And also, some folks have raised concerns with potential conflicts of interest. And as I understand this issue, there's a thought that perhaps if the water system, if there were areas of town that are undeveloped but might be and underserved by water, that might be good targets for development, would the selectmen say, hey, let's go ahead and extend service to those areas where a corporate entity or a non-selectman water commissioner might say, no, that doesn't make sense for the water system. So that issue has been raised, a question has been raised. There have been a number of concerns raised about the complexity of running a water system, and concerns in particular with safety. Some people feel that the system now is fine, that they've not experienced any problem, and they are very concerned that someone coming in would somehow foul that up to the detriment of, to allow contamination into the system and to the detriment of folks' health. I don't know that that is anything more than general fear, but there are certainly people who have expressed that strongly. And then the relationship with Hull and Cohasset has been a bit of a sticking point. There are other water systems in the state where one town serves residents in another town, but there's none that has such a large percentage, actually a little more than a third, of out-of-town residents. There are towns that serve other systems, other towns, where they sell wholesale at the town line. So in that situation, you'd be serving the entire town, but again, the other town, but you're selling at wholesale. Here, we would be selling retail to people, well, all of Hull and then people in Cohasset. So some folks think that's a recipe for disruption. There's concern that the out-of-town residents wouldn't have adequate say in terms of input on the governance and decisions. I think in response to that, there are 2 points come to mind. Rates will have to be uniform throughout. You can't distinguish between where people live in terms of setting the rates. In terms of capital projects, people have said, well, gee, are you going to not repair the, do repairs in Hull, for example, and favor Hingham? Or vice versa. I mean, some people have said, well, gee, the whole portion of the system's in bad shape. Are you going to be putting all of your efforts into capital in Hull? Well, the system's the system. If we own it, or whoever owns it, has to take care of the entire system. So I'm not sure I see that is a real issue, but certainly people have raised that. So that is an overview, I think, of the points that have been raised pro and con, but now I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about the financial analysis and where that came out.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Appreciate that. So I'm going to walk through a sensitivity analysis and I apologize in advance for people in the audience trying to look at the screen. I warn you, right now there will be small numbers. It will be hard to see, but this will be recorded. And for people who want some more background on some of the sensitivity work, you can look at the hours of the AdCom water subcommittee meetings that we've covered this extensively over a number of meetings. But in general, let me kick off by saying, as you know, the town's extensive analysis in conjunction with the work of town advisors Anderson Tax, excuse me, and Barry Dunn, indicates that ratepayers will save money under town ownership when compared to continued Aquarian ownership. On the other hand, Aquarian and its consultant Bloom Shapiro say ratepayers will pay marginally more under town ownership. Both parties have financial models to support their views. In undertaking a review of the financial models, I wanted to answer this question. If, to be conservative, I start with Aquarian's view of a cost to ratepayers from town ownership, what assumptions have to be believed to reach the town's conclusion of savings for ratepayers? In other words, is it a stretch to believe that town ownership will result in savings? To skip to the punchline, no, it is not a stretch. In my view, one need only make a few reasonable adjustments to Aquarian's financial model to see how ratepayers are better off financially under town ownership. And this is before one accounts for the many intangible benefits that proponents believe accrue to ratepayers from town ownership. As we go through my review, remember that water rates are set based on what it costs the water system operator to provide you with water. Within reason, a higher cost structure for the operator will lead to higher rates for customers or ratepayers. It worked. Based on discussions of this issue, you'll recognize the expense components in this chart on page 2. This represents a summary of Aquarian's cost components. This comes from Aquarian's financial model. These components form the basis for Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset's water rates today. And these components would stay roughly the same as long as any private entity owned the water system. You will note they include an approved equity cost, or profit, as well as treatment plant lease costs, and also included but not identified by line item are the costs to pursue rate cases and corporate overhead. These expenses are largely unique to private ownership, and the town would not have to charge ratepayers for them under town ownership. The astute observer will notice that the equity cost percentage on this chart differs from the 10.5% approved by the Department of Public Utilities in the recent rate case. This is due to the use of the line item total cost of service from the Aquarian financial model as the denominator. On page 3, we see the town ownership cost components. The piece of the pie that's called out represents the debt service on the acquisition debt incurred by the town to finance the purchase of the water system. It is a significant portion of the town ownership cost structure in the first 30 years. However, this debt will be paid off in 30 years, and once that happens, this cost wedge will disappear, saving ratepayers a lot of money each year going forward. Now, let's consider the two financial models and talk about some assumptions on which the town and Aquarian disagree. These disputed assumptions account for the difference between the two views of the impact of town ownership on ratepayers. Here come the small numbers, forgive me. At the top of page 4, in rows 1 through 4, you see some of the assumptions on which there has been a lot of discussion. Row 1 shows the assumed difference in the financial models between the cost for Hingham to borrow money and for Aquarian to borrow money. Aquarian's February 26th model implicitly assumes that this difference, or spread, was less than 1%, or 0.89% to be precise. 1% is also referred to as 100 basis points, in which case 0.89% is 89 basis points. In a March 12th letter from Aquarian's financial advisor to our committee, they indicated that in their opinion, the maximum basis point spread between the town's borrowing cost and Aquarian's should be 194 basis points, or 1.94%. We have used 1.93 basis points, 193 basis points here, and I can explain why later if you care. Row 2 represents a measure of how successful Aquarian is in persuading the Department of Public Utilities to grant their requested rate increases. As a for-profit enterprise, Aquarian seeks to maximize profit. That is not intended as a pejorative statement. It is a fact. And as a result, I believe it is reasonable to assume that Aquarian will be effective in their rate increase efforts. In the most recent rate case, Aquarian was granted 98% of the rate increase they requested, hence the 98% rate realization percentage as shown here on line 2. Aquarian asserts this line should be 82% instead, which represents the simple average of the percent they received from the DPU over the last 3 rate cases. It is not obvious to me that a simple average is appropriate here. Row 5 uses the Aquarian financial model, which they provided to our committee, to estimate the customer bill impact over 30 years, given the assumptions shown in gray above. Row 6 shows Aquarian's estimate of the town's aggregate operating costs over 30 years, and row 7, therefore, shows the incremental savings to ratepayers under town ownership under the assumptions shown above. The $2.1 million in incremental savings shown on line 7 can be compared to an incremental cost of $6.5 million if we used Aquarian's 82% rate realization percentage assumption in row 2. I'll show this result later. However, I believe that the $2.1 million in savings shown on this page is a reasonable place to start. And again, this is based on Aquarian's financial model and Aquarian's estimate of Hingham's cost to run the water system. Row 9 shows the incremental savings on a per connection or per customer per year basis. Moving down this column, we make adjustments to reflect the town's and its professional advisors' view of other disputed assumptions. We can talk more about any of these assumptions if you wish. Row 12 adjusts for an Aquarian ownership cost that is not included in row 5 that the town believes should be included. This row represents Aquarian's cost to lease the water treatment plant beyond the expiration of the current lease term. This add-back amount represents just a portion of the amount the town's advisors believe should be added back for this line item. We can return to discuss this if you wish. The next rows I discuss relate to town ownership costs included in row 6 that the town believes should not be included in row 6. Row 15 makes an adjustment based on the town's financial advisor's view that the prevailing wage rules will not have a material impact on the town's operating costs. Row 17 adjusts the town's cost to operate and maintain the water system to reflect the town's estimate of these costs as opposed to Aquarian's estimate of these costs. Row 18, therefore, shows the incremental savings per connection per year under town ownership throughout the next 30 years based on the town's assumptions shown above. It's important to remember that the cost of town ownership in this table includes the cost to retire the $112 million of acquisition and initial capital debt. Despite this, as you can see, ratepayers are still saving money versus Aquarian ownership over the first 30 years. Row 23 shows the annual incremental savings to ratepayers once the debt used to acquire the water system has been paid off in 2049. If you recall the pie chart of town costs I showed earlier, this is the impact of the wedge disappearing. For those who prefer charts, page 5 shows graphically what we just discussed. Recall my view that one need only make a few reasonable adjustments to Aquarian's financial model to see how ratepayers are better off financially from town ownership. The point of this chart is to demonstrate that fact. Moving from left to right, we go from Aquarian's view of the cost to ratepayers from town ownership to Hingham's view of the savings from town ownership. Each section, moving left to right, adjusts one assumption. Importantly, with the exception of the treatment plant lease expense, none of these assumptions are binary. For example, if you look at the fourth column from the right, you don't have to believe that the savings add back in operating and maintenance costs, as shown by the crosshatch column, is either $68.30 or zero. Instead, think of the savings adjustments, each of the crosshatch columns, as a range or a continuum. For each assumption, except the treatment plant lease, you can apply some of the savings, all of the savings, or none of the savings. Whatever amount you choose to use for each assumption, I think you will notice that, as I said, you don't have to subscribe to all of these assumptions to turn the red cost numbers at the left of the chart to positive savings numbers as you move right. Let's talk about the blue and red columns on the far left for a minute. The blue column shows Aquarion's view of the cost to ratepayers from town ownership, using Aquarion's assumptions. If you have followed our hearings, this value ties with the value Aquarion's financial consultant provided to Aquarion's chief financial officer in a letter dated February 25th, 2019. The blue column assumes Aquarion can borrow at just 89 basis points more than the town. We have seen no evidence to support this assumption, and therefore believe 193 basis points is much more reasonable. In fact, a case could be made that the spread should be even larger. If we increase the 89 basis point assumption to 193 basis points, we get to the red column. This section adopts Aquarion's assertion that they will achieve only 82% of their requested rate increase amounts over the next 30 years. As I mentioned earlier, they have done better than 82% as recently as October of last year. They want to do better than 82%, and I believe they will do better than 82%. The two far-right columns represent additional savings that could accrue to ratepayers based on changes in other assumptions. Savings due to these variables are not reflected in the peach or orange-colored columns. I want to spend some time on the second column from the right in particular, the column that shows $27.01 for those with really good eyesight. On page 6, we see the significant impact of varying this assumption. The town cost model on the previous pages assumes the acquisition debt, that is the $112 million, carries an interest rate of 3.75%. This is a conservative assumption. The current market for a 30-year AAA municipal borrowing is 3%, or 75 basis points less than the town includes in its cost model. If the town borrowed at the now market rate of 3%, interest expense savings would save ratepayers an additional $40.21 per year, as shown in the middle column. In conclusion, page 5 shows a range of outcomes, and only one scenario shows an incremental cost to ratepayers under town ownership. I exclude the farthest left scenario because, as I mentioned earlier, we have seen no evidence that Aquarion can borrow at just 89 basis points more than the town. As I said at the outset, I don't think it is a stretch to see how ratepayers benefit financially from owning a water system in the near term, and I'm highly confident that they will benefit significantly in the long term. With that, I'm happy to take questions.
I meant to say this at the start of my remarks. So the subcommittee voted 4-1 in favor of this article. I think we're ready to
Okay.
take questions.
Questions from our colleagues on advisory? Oh, we're not a shy group. Come on.
Just a real simple question. The top of the pie charts, it says ownership 2035, operating expenses. Can you just provide some guidance there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some movement in the numbers in the early years related to when the town converts short-term financing to long-term financing. So I kind of wanted to get away from some of that noise on the town side. I wanted to use the same year for both. And then in 2036, I believe it is, the treatment plant lease expires. So there's as I mentioned, it's a debate between the town and Aquarion about what the ultimate 2037 lease expense will be. But I wanted to kind of avoid that. So I tried to pick something in the middle that would hopefully be as much of a steady state as there would be.
Okay. And do these numbers include the MRAM charge?
So John Asher can help me if I screw this up. But suffice it to say that the Aquarion numbers that I've used in my model, when I've estimated what Aquarion's costs would be, include a 2% MRAM charge, as I understand their model. There is an input that when I look at the model, shows 2%, and so I'm assuming that's baked into their numbers. They are currently seeking, I believe, a change in that from 2 to 3%. So the 3% number is not rolled through here. And so that would be how I would explain it. And like I said, I'm using Aquarian spreadsheet, so I think I'm doing it properly.
Additional questions from my colleagues? That says we're eager to hear from the folks in the audience. As I reminded you earlier, please ask to be recognized, and we'll ask that you keep your marks to 4 minutes. Are you indicating that you'd like to speak, ma'am? Well, would you please put that down? It's distracting. Thank you.
I have another question. Sorry.
George.
So, Dave, I know you're not a prevailing wage expert, but I've heard this term and varying interpretations of how it might affect us or not. Can you just provide a little guidance as to what it is and how it might or might not affect us?
Saying I'm not an expert is a polite way of describing my knowledge. I have little more to go on than you do, other than to say that, I guess, let me tell you how I looked at the prevailing wage issue, because I think it is, certainly from the town's advisor's perspective, his assessment was that, I think it's fair to say, I'm paraphrasing here, in the grand scheme of things, it would be a wash, which isn't to say in any given year there isn't an impact.
Right.
But at least in his most recent comments to our committee, he described how there are multiple factors that will impact that. And as in tight labor markets, I understood him to say that the prevailing wage impact was less significant because all wages would be rising and kind of converging at some type of, asymptotic wage amount. And maybe in weaker labor markets, there would be a delta if there was a lag in the prevailing wage changing according to a market wage. He also made the point that contractors who would do work for Hingham in this, as well as work for other maybe private entities, as he pointed out, aren't charging people different amounts. So he used that to suggest that perhaps there would be some equivalence across the issue. Now, Aquarian has cited and had sent us many sites on the other side of the view, which is to say that it's a more significant and reliable issue for a municipal owner. And I guess I would just go back to, part of what we tried to call out here was to say, even in Aquarian's assessment of the impact on the town of a prevailing wage.
Sure.
In that middle column there, you're talking about, a $22 per person per year incremental delta. So if you wanted to subscribe to the complete view that prevailing wages would impact it, Aquarian would suggest that you should strip, zero out that column that says prevailing wage and off you go. So, I mean, again, as we looked at it, we didn't become experts in it. What we wanted to try to do was assess its relative impact on the model. And I would say in the grand scheme of things, it's an issue, but it's quite modest.
Okay. So even taking Aquarian's most optimistic view, it's a marginal impact on the total financial package.
Yeah, there's a disagreement, if you will, on two people coming up with a number in the neighborhood of $500 million.
Right.
The disagreement about prevailing wage amounted to around $9 million.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. Yes, sir. Please come up to the mic and identify yourself. And Julie will be timing for you.
Okay, good evening. Hope you can hear me all here. Can everybody hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's been a long time since I've been back. My name is John Hersey. Just to make a couple of points here. You spoke of the aquifer. In 2004, at the transfer station, there was 100 gallons of super spec paint that was dumped at the landfill up at the top. If you go up the transfer station, there's a hill, and that's what they call the whatever. Anyways, and this is the super spec paint that was dumped there by the OK from the might have been the selectmen too, but the DPW. Okay, if you look up on the web where super spec is sold today, you can find out where it came from. That's all I'm going to say on that issue. Okay. Now, as far as you feel as though that the town could run the water company better than, you can run the water company better than the water company? I disagree. Okay, a short-term example is the fact that you people all agreed to spend $86,000 to pay someone off that was sexually harassed by an employee of this town, and she left town. That was very sad. Yet the employee is still working for the town. That's very sad. Now, as of this past Sunday, I went up the transfer station, and I took some pictures. That's very disturbing. The selectmen have them now. So does a Mr. Mayo, of a steam cleaning going on when you first drive in down below there, where the cubes come out. Steam cleaning going on, and all this residue is going into retention pond, and it's going into Brewer Reservation, it's going into the country club, it's going into the town river, and it's going into the waterfront. And then the people ask you a question, gee, why do we have any clams down in Hingham Harbor? Well, there's one of the reasons right there. All right? Very sad. All right? Another picture I've caught here, and the selectmen have these, I just gave them to them today, of an employee washing the boss's car that's up to the transfer station. Okay? That's very disheartening. I took this picture, the last picture I took, and I was so disturbed over this, I had to sneak in there. I just left. Okay? I think it's a big mistake to buy this water company. We don't need it. What are we gaining as citizens? I have no problem with my water I'm getting from the water company, no problem at all. If there's a problem anybody's had, I never heard of a citizen, a ratepayer, saying, "Oh, I don't like the water company. Their terrible service is terrible." Nobody's ever said that. Okay? I've gone to several meetings. I've never caught the water company with a fib. I'm going to be nice tonight to you. With a fib, okay? And the transparency. I don't think it is here. I don't think it is here in the government. And I'm very sad at 70 years with this town and what you're trying to do. And last but not least, I feel very, very bad for the poor people in Hull who don't have a voice in this. They pay, but they don't know what the hell they're going to get. I hope everybody that's listening will not buy this water company. We don't need it. They're doing a hell of a job. Leave them alone. What happens to the poor employees? They're going to lose their jobs. I rest my case. Have a good night. Thank you very much. Anything else you want to say to me? I didn't think so.
Thank you, Mr. Hersey. Someone else like to speak? Yes, Ted.
I think people are wondering whether they are speaking. I think people are wondering whether they are speaking about the economic. Microphone, please.
Come to.
Sorry.
We're entertaining questions at. Please stand at the mic, Ted, because you're tall enough. It's going to work. We are discussing all of the of Article MM, which is the proposal to purchase the water company. We're not just discussing the financial elements.
Okay, I think there were some people in the audience who were wondering whether we're just speaking to the economic piece right now.
No,
or,
broadly.
Okay.
Broadly, to anything having to do with purchasing the water company.
Okay, all right. I'll hold my comments at this point.
Okay?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Ms. Rowe?
Here. Good evening. Polly Rowe, 9 Rockview Road, Hull. My name is Polly Rowe. I'm a former longtime Hingham resident and Hull homeowner since 2003. Soon, residents in Hingham will vote on their selectmen's proposal that will have a long-term impact on Hull residents' health, safety, and economic well-being. Hull residents, more than 1/3 of the total ratepayers, do not get a vote in deciding whether or not to purchase Aquarian's water system. We also do not get a vote in deciding how the system would be run under the Hingham Selectmen's control. The Hingham Selectmen are mandating that Hull ratepayers pick up 1/3 of the Selectmen's $1.5 million legal battle fees and 1/3 of the $112 million acquisition costs for Hingham only to own it. This does not sound fair to Hull residents, nor does it sound legal. I am exhausted from the futility of trying to get answers and dealing with the chronic stress and anxiety created by Hingham's being, quote, under the gun, as one of the water company acquisition study committee members phrased it when this process started just about 2 months ago. I have sought information from Hull town officials, Hingham officials, and attended almost every single Hingham meeting on the Aquarian issue. My questions concerning issues that will seriously impact the safety, quality, and reliability of a precious fundamental resource, our drinking water, have been ignored and dismissed at every step of the way. Hingham officials have shifted the burden onto me to provide the very answers I'm seeking from them. I have pointed out many serious cracks in the Hingham Selectmen's and Water Company Acquisition Study Committee's story. Just one of the many issues I have raised with Hingham officials is the fact that the private contract operator, Veolia North America, that submitted an estimate to Hingham officials just in the last 5 years was sued by the Michigan Attorney General for its part in Flint lead poisoning, fined by the Massachusetts Attorney General for dumping raw sewage into Plymouth Harbor, and has settled with the city of Pittsburgh for failures such as the miscalculation of the chemicals used to control corrosion in lead pipes and improper customer billing. Hull residents will not have a voice in choosing the private contract operator on whom we will rely for safe drinking water, but we will be asked to pay both with our health and our wallets if a private contract operator, quote, breaches its contractual obligations, end quote, as Plymouth officials say Veolia did just a couple of years ago. The fact that Hingham officials have even considered doing business with Veolia should be a red flag to you to vote no on all of the acquisition warrant articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rowe. Would anyone else like to speak? Yes, sir? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Paul Smith. I live at 121 Nantasket Avenue, and I've been a Hull resident for 15 years. My background is I'm an expert in piping. I've written 2 best-selling books. One of my jobs, I was the worldwide chief engineer for a company in charge of piping at Basco Services. I've given seminars worldwide and countrywide on piping. I'm a licensed professional engineer. I've got a master's degree in engineering and a master's degree in finance. So my comments are both personal and professional. It's common knowledge that most of the oldest infrastructure found in the system is in Hull. Hull's water mains and pipe are in major need of either maintenance or replacement. So it troubles me that elected officials in Hingham have been kind of cavalier about it. But first of all, I see that there's going to be 3 water commissioners who are selectmen. I wonder what a selectman gets to be qualified to be a water commissioner, and why there's not 1/3 of them being from Hull, the people who are paying 1/3 of the bill. There is also, I understand, the intermunicipal agreement issue. Is that going to be signed? Is that going to be prepared? Is that going to go in front of the Hull town meeting? And is it actually going to happen? I'm quite concerned about the company that it was just mentioned that is one of their main consultants, and their main consultant was the people who caused all the problem in Flint, Michigan. They allowed it to be approved, and one of the big things is when water gets mixed, the impact of water mixing. I'm not hearing any discussion about we're taking the water from the MWA and mixing it with another one, and that's what happened in Flint, Michigan. Connectivity of water. And if you don't worry about that, you're going to worry about it when you have all the problems with your children, with their and the impact. So remember Flint, Michigan, and the people who allowed it to happen, denied it was a problem, and only fixed it when there was a gun at the head, are the people that you have brought in to represent you. I'm very concerned about that. And considering Hull is paying 1/3 of the money, I'm a little concerned that we don't have 1/3 of the management. That is 1/3 of the commissioners, and I understand there may be a team of 5 people running it afterwards, having representation of we're paying 1/3. Did you ever hear taxation without representation? That's essentially what we're having, and I'm very concerned about that. So in summary, I'm concerned about the Flint people. I'm concerned about the management of this organization, and I'm concerned that the intermunicipal agreement is not being signed, and we don't even know if it's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Yes, sir?
Hello. My name is Richard Booth. I live at 1181 Nantasket Avenue in Hull. And I'd like to urge the advisory committee to advise against the proposed purchase of the Hingham Water area assets. Okay. Try again. Sure. Hello.
There we go.
I'd like to urge the advisory committee to vote against for the following reasons. As a Hingham resident who I have never met, wrote in his excellent letter to the editors that the risk of this purchase to the citizens of Hingham, North Cohasset, and especially Hill are very dangerously high in comparison with the estimated benefits. Why do it? The estimated cost savings for ratepayers from lower borrowing costs and elimination of corporate profit margins will be more than offset by the loss of the bulk purchasing power and other economies of scale in billing, equipment purchasing, maintenance costs, and are dwarfed, in my opinion, by the risks and the expense of owning a seriously aged infrastructure for delivering drinking water to the 3 towns. I did not comment on the financial analysis, but I wonder if both analyses have a failure to estimate the impact of the reality of sea rise level and due from climate change and global warming. I think Hingham would be buying a system that requires much, much deeper financial pockets than Hingham residents should want to pay for. The second reason is that I believe that the overburdened Board of Selectmen will not have the time or ability to run a drinking water system without the shortchanging the town on their other duties. I think they should not be fooled to think that even an experienced water superintendent, a licensed contract operator, an advisory committee would be enough to address those risks. Third, and most importantly to the Hull and North Cohasset residents, there will be no adequate legal or other enforceable remedies in the event of errors, mismanagement, or bias by the Waters Commissioners, the Superintendent, in connection with the timing and allocation of capital improvements and repairs to our community, even in emergencies. I'm not talking about bad water. The DEP has regulations about that. I mean the making of judgments that the needs of the system are consistently more important in the areas that happen to be outside of Hull. We will have no contract rights, only one advisory-only vote on the advisory committee. The trust us to act in good faith response is not enough. Would it be enough for you if the situation were reversed? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booth. Ma'am?
Can you hear me?
No.
Bree Brazil, 1 Warfield Ave of Hull. Thank you for letting me address the committee. I live in Hull with my husband and my young son. We've called Hull home for over 20 years, and we love its sense of community and hope to stay there for years to come. As a mom, my son's health and his future are of the utmost importance to me. Any parent would feel the same, I'm sure. As a family, we regularly have conversations about stories we see on the news or local issues and try to provide our son with perspective. The purchase of this water company is the most significant local issue I can recall in quite some time, and I find it surprising there hasn't been more discussion in town and more information provided to us by our elected officials. As a result, I've had to do some research on my own to learn about the water company purchase. There have been several articles in the Hull Times, which I've read, and I've talked with many people. In looking closely at it, I have approached this issue as a ratepayer, but in particular, I have come at it from the perspective of being a Hull resident and also as a mom. My concerns have to do with the burden that we are placing on the next generation, on children like my own, and the impact Hingham ownership would have on the quality of our water and of our family's health. For those who follow the news in Hull, you must be aware of the ongoing conversations about our schools, the recent discussion on whether or not to install a turf field at the high school, but there are serious issues with the school buildings as well, and I've read that there are issues with several of Hingham school buildings as well, too. Why would we want to pass on the responsibility of running a water company to our children and our children's children when we are currently having a difficult time maintaining what we already have? I'm concerned also that the Hingham Board of Selectmen have no training in the field of water supply management. I heard that they were planning on taking some sort of a class, and that makes me very uncomfortable. One class, and how would that make you qualified to run a water system? I'd imagine that the people of Aquarian have multiple degrees and a great deal of experience. If we already have the best, why would we be looking to change that? I say we, but really I mean Hingham, because Hull has no say in any of this. Our children are growing up in a time of such unrest. The last thing we want to do is create more uncertainty for their future. And the last thing that I, as a mom, want to be is uncertain about the water that my son is drinking. We would be giving up the best in the business for something completely unpredictable. And I hope that the committee will consider this when they have their vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. We've had several speakers who are not in favor of this. I'd like to make sure both sides get a chance to speak. Is there anyone who would like to speak in favor? Mr. Taylor.
Hi, good evening. Can people hear? Do I have to lift it up? Okay. Hi, thank you for all your hard work on this. I know the time and energy that you've all expended on this really incredibly important topic. Jim Taylor, 3 Gristmill Lane in Hingham. As you may know, I have a unique perspective to this, having served as the AdCom liaison since this effort started in 2012. And I continued in that role until I finished my term on AdCom in 2017. During that time, I attended every meeting at which this was discussed, including all the executive sessions with the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee. Since I left AdCom, I've stayed involved and followed this matter closely, analyzed every spreadsheet, pathetically read every page of the DPU filings, and from all I've learned, it has become clear to me that it is in the best interest of the town and ratepayers to exercise their right and purchase a water company. At the end of the day, my support is all about control for the ratepayers, something we do not have today. That control extends to the rates and investment in the system, the control over how we govern and run the system, and control over our impact to the environment and preservation of our watershed. I don't have time to go over all of these in detail tonight, so I thought I'd touch on a few of the most critical. To me, the economics are obvious. There will be significant cost savings to ratepayers both near term and over the long term. This will result in slower and lower rate increases and more predictable capital investments over the next 30 years, at which point our ownership costs and rates will drop significantly. There's been a lot of discussion over worst case scenarios. What would happen if there was a significant issue that impacted the water system? Actually, we've already had one of those circumstances, which I think will illustrate for us the differences between public and private ownership. Our water system had terrible water quality in the 80s and 90s, resulting in the DEP mandating that the water treatment plant be built. This was completed in 1996 for a total cost of $37 million, financed by the then owner, American Water Works, through the issuance of bonds. And at the time, it effectively doubled our water rates. Under normal town-related ownership, we would have funded this through 20-year low-cost municipal bonds, meaning that the water treatment plant should have been paid off in full in 2016, with total principal and interest payments totaling around $50 million. However, due to the necessity to provide a profit return to a private company, we are nowhere near the end of paying this project off. In fact, our debt and profit payment by us goes on for another 17 years, totaling $60 million. Believe it or not, by the end of those years, the final project cost to the ratepayers for the water treatment plant will be over $125 million. That's for a $37 million capital project. That's the impact private ownership can have. I have heard all the plans that the Board of Selectmen have for both governance and the operation of the system. I'm confident of these plans, and I'm particularly impressed with how they've evolved with the public comment that they've received. There's no such vehicle with private ownership. The only format is during their rate case, which occurs sporadically, maybe every 3 to 5 years. That's not what I consider transparency. Considering that Aquarian received 98% of what they asked for in the last rate case, including an unprecedented annual surcharge, that's not what I call consumer protection. I hope the residents of Hull and Cohasset, from what I hear, probably not, but I hope that they've seen how open the process is in Hingham and how their voices will always be heard and considered. Lastly, the major question is, who would I want to partner with moving forward on this most precious resource? A for-profit company whose ownership is unpredictable and unreliable, or my neighbors who drink the water and pay the same bills as I do? You know, it would have been easy for the Board of Selectmen to walk away from this years ago. This has been hard work and consumed a tremendous amount of time and energy by everyone involved. But the right thing to do is not always the easiest thing. And the right thing today is to purchase and finally gain control over our water system. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir?
Good evening. My name is Charles Ferlot. I'm president and CEO of Aquarian Company. And with your permission, I'd like to grab 4 minutes, if I can. Anyway, I'll wing it on this. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words. You can probably figure out which side I'm going to root for. I've been in the water business, and with Aquarian specifically, for 32 years. I've worked and lived in 3 countries, and so have seen the administration and governance of public water supply from a number of different perspectives. This much I know. It is all about infrastructure replacement. The business is exceedingly capital intensive, and because we're dealing with an ingested product, you can't kick the can down the street as you possibly could with other physical assets such as schools and libraries, even town halls. England, where I worked for a number of years, and France have gone to the private model of public water supply. with prudent oversight by government regulatory authorities. They do so because it works and because government administrations never, ever have enough capital to address the needs. In fact, the history and performance in America of successive governments at the federal, state, and municipal level on infrastructure has been abysmal. Abysmal. Look at our roads and bridges. The town has not made its case. Ever since the study committee released its findings late last summer, claiming savings of around, I think it was 136 million, their case has crumbled upon greater scrutiny. It's been a downward spiral for the town's case, and frankly, nowhere was this more apparent to me than a couple of weeks ago when the town's witness from Anderson Tax, when asked for a detail of his work product, a working version, if you will, claimed proprietary information. Couldn't give it up. Does he hold the secret sauce for Coca-Cola? The biggest purchase in the history of the town is being contemplated, and the star witness does not cooperate. But there's another side. Absent the great civility of this evening, there's dirty mudslinging has become an everyday occurrence. The selectmen have refused to debate with us publicly. They have refused to have a neutral third party review both economic models, and a week ago the expert witness is being selective on what he can surrender. The truth is that in the absence of a strong argument, we now have a dirty game of unidirectional mudslinging. Aquarian and his supporters are denigrated on a daily basis. And the social media feed supporters of the selectmen play an appalling game of bullying and intimidation. You better support the selectmen on the takeover issue or you'll be embarrassed, you'll be humiliated, and you'll be attacked. The social media feed has become a toxic cauldron of hatred. There are a handful of social media hawks influenced by Town Hall, and the selectmen, in fairness, do not control them, cannot control them, but they can influence them significantly, and yet the verbal slaughter and intimidation is allowed to continue. Is this the best we can do? I respectfully request the advisory committee to recommend a secret ballot at the April 22nd meeting. The selectmen will surely fight this, but residents of the town should not be intimidated or fear reprisal. One last point for those who bang the drum of local control of the water supply. Aquarian does not, triple underline, does not, nor will it ever control the water supply in Massachusetts, but neither will the town. The water supply is under the solid and indisputable purview of the state of Massachusetts. Lastly, when the town, any town, is facing its largest financial decision ever, we ought to engage in a higher level of debate. We have roughly a month left to do this, and the citizens of these three towns, frankly, deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Furlat. Additional comments? Yes, ma'am?
Judith Van Ham, Hull, Massachusetts. At the beginning of this session, I understood that I could ask a question. Is that accurate?
May I ask a question? Yes.
Will you answer it?
We'll do our best.
Okay, great. I have served on the Weir River Watershed Association, so I'm particularly listening to issues having to do with the health of the aquifer and of the river. And I heard that mentioned at the beginning of this meeting as one of the topics that is being considered. And I heard it mentioned by at least one person who came up to speak. So I would like to find out what the Hingham selectmen would propose that they're doing to protect the aquifer and the running of the water in the river, which, as I think you may be aware, gets dangerously low during the summer. I have attended Aquarian meetings in which they have a plan for how they will fill one of the lakes, or I don't know if it's called a lake, but one of the ponds during the summer so that there will be a water supply improvement in the river in this coming season, and they're thinking about how to solve this issue. So I'd like to hear more about what the selectmen plan to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone who can address that? Mr. Healy?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the forum, spoke
Paul,
to
we have a lot of guests in the room.
Sure. My name is Paul Healy. I'm one of the selectmen here in Hingham. At the forum, a couple Saturdays ago, we addressed that. It would be the intended policy of the town to continue with this, and that's to acquire the land around the aquifer, to protect the water source, the wellheads. This is something that we've done for quite some time. We've acquired 278 acres over the last 50 years, including open space to the tune of $9 million, 133 acres in recent times, and in different areas where the aquifer is at its most sensitive. And that not only includes a benefit to the town of Hingham, but that's had a collateral benefit to the town of Norwell, kind of allay the fears that the Hull residents may have that, you know, Hingham's only looking out for itself. We're protecting the quality of the water so that not only Hingham can have good water, but so can Hull, so can Northern Cohasset. In that time, Aquarian has made no such acquisition of any such property, and I think Mr. Berry, Charlie Berry, spoke to his efforts to get them to participate in this effort, and they declined. So, yes, Ms. Van Ham, this is something that this town has been doing, not just in the last 6 or 7 years, but this has been something that this town has done for the last 50 years, and it is something that we will continue to do.
Paul, I think part of the question was whether there's any plan to address low flow, I guess low seasonal flow in the Weir River. I mean, as opposed to protecting water quality, I think this was also water quantity. I mean, I think that was part of your question.
You know, Victor, I got to say in candor, this is something we're fleshing out as we speak. We'll be able to speak to that in greater detail in forthcoming days. You know, we want to be able to recharge the system. We want to take steps to make sure that the system is properly recharged. That's something that the planning board has done for years in terms of the decisions that it's rendered with respect to subdivisions, special permits, especially in South Hingham. This is something that we're very sensitive to up there. The South Hingham Working Group issued a 60-page working paper which speaks to the problem of pressure up in that neck of the woods. This is something we're acutely aware of. You know, when we had before us a grant of location for Abington Street a couple of weeks ago. The water company wants to run a line. They're going to loop it. I asked Mr. Olson, who's their engineer, is this going to increase the pressure up in that area? And the answer was no. So we're aware that this is a problem. We've identified it as such. And, you know, we will take those steps.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Kirk?
Good evening. I apologize. I came in late, so I didn't hear the beginning if you spoke of the aquifer, but I can just answer that question and I'll sit down.
Name and address.
Kirk Schultz, 65 Prospect Street.
Thank you.
And Secretary of the Hingham Water Supply Committee, not the Water Supply Acquisition Committee, but the Water Supply Committee that I've been a member of since 2002. And we meet with Aquarian on a regular basis, 2 to 3 times a year, to speak about that issue among other issues. So the topic of where we're going to get our additional supply source is something that we routinely have discussed. It's a plan that we've worked on together, the town, through the Water Supply Committee and Aquarian. And so to allay Judith's fears, you know I'm past president of the Weir River Watershed Association and instrumental in getting the stress assessment for the Weir River back in 2006. I can assure you that that issue would be something that the advisory committee to the selectmen or whoever is on the board of the water commissioners would be advised to, be it town ownership or, you know, if it stays with Aquarian, the Water Supply Committee will continue to meet with Aquarian and work on that answer also. So that is something that, one way or the other, will be solved appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Additional comments? Yes, sir? John?
Good evening. I'm John Walsh, Vice President of Operations for Aquarion. First, I wanted to just get some facts out related to a couple important issues. Rates. So our rates have increased 1.7, an average of 1.7% a year since we have bought the system in 2002. We provided the backup so that you can see how we came up with that number. If you hear another number out there about that, that average increase, I would ask that you ask for how someone calculated that. Second of all, unaccounted for water, which some of you know the term. Many of you would think of it as leakage. We have unquestionably been successful in reducing unaccounted for water. It's now, we've done that over the last 4 years, and it is now at a level that's lower than the statewide average. And on collaboration with the town, I've heard a little bit about that in the last week or two. And this is specifically about coordinating our water main replacements with the town's paving projects. And we have done that coordination for years with your DPW staff. This year, 2019, 7 of the 8 water main projects in Hingham of our projects are on roads that the DPW plans to pave. One of the reasons why we're doing those projects is because the town plans to pave those roads. The 8th road is a private road, so the town's not paving it. I think that speaks volumes of the level of coordination between us and town staff. Steve Olson, our director of operations, and I sat with your town engineer and your town administrator for one of these meetings, and then Steve did a second meeting with them. But what's more important to me is for folks to understand more about this business and more about the people at Aquarion. Right now, there are more than 700,000 people. Right now, and every minute of every day, there's over 700,000 people in 59 cities and towns in New England who rely on us to provide them with safe drinking water. And it's a big responsibility. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of variables, and it's a 24-hour-a-day job. And there are many risks. Aquarion has developed the people, the systems, the processes, and the standards to mitigate those risks, to ensure that our customers' health is protected. It's a serious business. I've sat in a lot of meetings in this room, and I don't think some town officials understand the responsibility of providing safe drinking water. I've heard people like the idea of control, but with control comes responsibility. When you talk about risks, in this room I've heard discussions of protecting against financial risks with insurance or with a contract operator with a strong balance sheet. Before you think about protecting yourself against financial risk, you should be thinking about the risk to customers and the risk to their health in particular, and how you plan to mitigate those risks, because that's the world that you live in this business. We don't think about protecting our financial risks first. We think about protecting our customers. Aquarion staff are experts at what we do. Most of us are engineers, scientists, water system operators, and technicians. And some of our team grew up in these communities. Most of us have decades of experience. I started in this industry 30 years ago in graduate school, and I earned my engineering degrees at UMass Amherst, which most people don't realize is one of the nation's leading graduate programs for drinking water treatment. My coworker, Steve Olson, our director of operations, was actually in the same graduate program, and we did our research on drinking water technology that is now widely used in the U.S. I tell you this to give you context. The people at Aquarian are experts at providing safe drinking water. Proof of this is the award that we have received from DEP for the past 5 years. DEP looked at what they categorize as the 257 medium and large water systems across the state of Massachusetts and picked 19 of us to get this award last year. It's a very select group. I've heard suggestions that this award is no big deal. It's a big deal to the 19 water utilities who received it, and it's a big deal to their customers, and it's a big deal to our customers in Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Yes? Go ahead.
John, before you sit down. I have a question for you, and I'd actually ask the exact same question of the Board of Selectmen and the proponents, too. I'd invite their answer after I hear yours. So one of the features of private ownership of the water utility is the involvement of the State Department of Public Utilities. And one of the things I'm trying to get my head around is what value DPU involvement adds for the people who consume the water, and whether that value would be replicated or how it would be replicated under municipal ownership. So if I could hear your view on that, followed by the selectmen's view on that, I'd be grateful.
Sure. Well, first of all, if the town buys the water system, the town will not only step into our shoes, it also steps into the DPU shoes. The DPU oversees, most importantly, our rates, but I provided to probably everyone in this group here what is the contract between us and our customers. That's our rules and regulations. The DPU oversees those rules and regulations and reviews them at every one of our rate cases. That oversight over rates and everything that goes into rates, including all of our expenditures, our infrastructure investment, that oversight all goes away. That customer advocacy goes away. And the town steps into the DPU's shoes. I heard last week a suggestion that the DEP would step into those shoes. There is a reason that the DEP is not in charge of our rules and regulations that sit with the DPU. It's because that's not what the DEP does. And I think it was a little bit alarming to me that folks who've been involved in this for a long time don't understand the DEP's role and the DPU's role. And it should start there with some folks in here should ask the question, how do you proceed when it's not even understood what your regulators do and what is going away if the town buys the system?
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Anybody want to speak, or shall I move on? Okay. Who lost?
I did. I lost. Karen Johnson, Board of Selectmen. So, Eric, I don't know. I've spoken to this a couple times. You may or may not have been in the room when I talked about it. But, you know, the DPU's involved. I sort of liken it in a rough analogy to the SEC. So you need a state agency or a public agency to represent the public's voice in negotiations with a monopolistic utility. So without the DPU, you know, as Victor alluded to earlier, all of the decisions get made behind closed doors because unlike a municipality, they're not subject to open meeting law and public records rules, right? So the DPU plays, I think, a very imperfect role, if you will, in representing the public voice in the rate setting process. You know, the process that we have publicized and that we will undertake is the process that you all have just gone through along with us, which is analyzing every dollar that's in every budget to make sure that the policy decisions that the policymakers are making can be implemented at the budgetary level. So that's the bright light of, I think, public transparency then plays the role of the DPU in the municipal rate setting process.
Thank you. Josh? Yep.
Hi, Josh Cromhall, 16 Windsor Drive. I'm a member of the Acquisition Study Committee. Just a couple observations on the DPU process. One is, we might think of them as having a lot of experience with regard to, comparing different rate structures, different systems, but the reality is, as we've heard, the vast majority of the towns are publicly owned water systems, so they really don't have a lot of experience setting rates for private companies in Massachusetts. So I don't think they have quite the experience that we might assume that they have. Second thing is, frankly, it's a pretty chummy system, organization. I mean, the incoming head of the DPU is a former Eversource executive. So, I'm sure they're doing a good job, but, there's issues going on when it's so insular. The third thing that is most disturbing to me, which we came to understand, is the system is actually pretty flawed, because the way it works is, as we heard from Dave, and we've heard at other meetings, is, they establish the cost, and then you get some profit percentage on top of that cost. Typically, I think they've gotten like 10.5%, which is a pretty good profit to get, regardless of how well you do your job. But the bigger the cost, the bigger the profit, right? So if it's $10 cost, 10%, you're going to get $1 in profit. If it's $100 cost, you're going to get $10, et cetera. The way, now you might assume, at least this is what I assumed, was that when they were doing a rate case analysis, the DPU would look over some period of time, look at the average cost per year, or average over some period of years, and use that as the cost to figure out the profit, right? I just assumed it would be that way because that's the fairest way to do it. That's not what they do. There is a thing called the test year, which Aquarian decides what year it is, and it's the year before they go in for their rate case, and they load up, and that's the only year that counts for the cost analysis. And what Aquarian does is they totally load up their costs for that test year, and then the rate gets set based on that one test year. So some of you, I assume, well, certainly the subcommittee has seen it. I don't know if everybody's seen it. But we have that chart that we have shown where we have the capital investment, right? And it's, every year, it's a scarily tiny amount. But what's startling about it is it's tiny, tiny, tiny. 1 year really big, tiny, tiny, tiny. That 1 year is the test year, right? So what Aquarian does is, frankly, they rig the system. They don't make investments. They make a large amount of investments in 1 year. They get the big bump in the profit, and they go back down. It's a really horribly flawed system. I don't know why it is that way, but I don't want people, frankly, to get the impression that this system is really protecting us, because at least based on the analysis that we've seen, it really isn't.
Thank you. Let's go back to comments from the public. In the back of the room on the right.
Hi, can you hear me? I feel like I have to go on my tiptoes. I don't know how to adjust it. Here we go. Chrissy Roberts, 29 Pleasant Street. I don't have a typed up sheet of notes. I wasn't planning on speaking tonight, so forgive me for jotting some things down on my phone here. I am very much in favor of this purchase. I feel like a lot of really smart and dedicated people have spent many thousands of hours and many years looking into this, and a lot of them have said this is the right thing to do. I know when I started thinking about this, I thought of it in two ways. Can we afford it, and can we do it? And it certainly seems like not only can we afford it, but we can save millions and maybe even many, many millions over the long run. Can we do it? a big aha moment for me was the fact that I found out it's 96% or something higher than that of other towns already do this. And I said, well, gosh, if anybody can do it, it's Hingham. I think there's a lot of fear. Obviously, a lot of Hull people are concerned. There's fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of government. I get that. Change is hard. But again, I come back to not only if 96% of other towns can do this, so can we. But, I mean, we're your neighbors. We're not a big for-profit company. We're the people that are going to be drinking the water and paying for the water. And why would I be so in favor of this? I'm not benefiting from this personally, being in favor of it. I want local people to make these decisions. I don't think Aquarion is bad. I don't, think they're terrible people or anything, but they are a for-profit company, and they should be, and that's okay. But I don't think our water should be for-profit, and not when so many other towns can do this. I think it's a little telling that they don't want to sell so badly. I think, are we a cash cow for them? I don't know. I don't think they want, I don't think they're trying so hard out of the good of their hearts. Again, not because they're bad people, because it's business, and their business is telling them, hold on to this. This is good. This is going to be really, good in the long run. Don't give it up. I think it's also telling that things like unaccounted for water and main replacement have been so much better since we started this, it seems like, in 2012. I'm talking about fear. I'm afraid of what we'll go back to if we don't buy this, and it isn't top of mind. I'm a mom too, and I would love to see this purchase happen for myself, for my kids, for grandkids. I think it's good for a lot of reasons, mostly because, like I said, I would rather have the people that are drinking the water and bathing their kids in the water and paying for the water making these decisions, not some global for-profit company who's been sold over and over again. And if I don't like what's happening, I can vote you out. We get to do that, every year. And I mean, the Hull folks have no say over Aquarion or Eversource or Macquarie or any of it. I don't know why they're so fearful of their neighbors that are sitting right here, and that we do have very much a say. My gosh, all these meetings that have taken place and will continue to take place for many years will have a say. And thank you for letting me have my say tonight. And I would very, very much like to buy the water company. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. Gentleman on the aisle.
Again, like my predecessor, I didn't intend to speak, so pardon the phone usage. My name is Ben Bastinelli. I'm a 50-year resident of the town of Hingham. I currently live in Hull, 123 Samoset Ave. I have spent the last 12 years as a publicly elected water commissioner in another town. I'm intimate with the operations of these water facilities and what's necessary and how they function, the legislation and everything. There's been a lot of good surface scratching with all the analysis that's been done. You've spent a lot of time on it. It's perfect. It's almost bulletproof, but it doesn't speak to the real issues of owning and operating a facility. And it's very difficult to step in at this point in time and take over a facility. You can buy it, you can come up with the money, but you got to be able to manage it and operate it. And nowhere in the municipal world can a municipality compete cost effectively with the private sector. The cost to operate this facility without an outside entity, and I'm speaking from knowledge of where I'm coming from, is $3 to $5 million annually. You will never reduce that cost as you continue to implement your workforce, your management, your equipment, your people, your wage and municipality issues into that system, you will never reduce that number. You will maintain it or exceed it before the bond premium is paid in full. Lastly, speaking to the selectmen, I know, and you all know, the workload that they have. They will never be able to keep up with the legislation and all of the stuff that goes into the running of a plant and into the meetings that are required and the background and things that have to happen. You will never set the rates. You will never control reducing the cost. You will never capture a reduced value that I'm hearing about tonight, 20, 30, 40 million over how many years that the ratepayers are going to save. As you heard from Aquarian officials, that is all regulated. It's all mandated. It all comes from legislative water consumption, water management acts, what you draw from aquifers, what you draw from wells, how you draw it down, how big your community is, what the projection is for increased water consumption. You actually have to ask for the usage of more water. You just don't draw it down when it looks like, well, we need more water, we'll just draw it. You have to actually file a plan and get approval to draw more water and consume more water. So there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of time and effort, and that's why in other communities that do run their facilities, they have a separate commission that oversees the water community. Thank you.
So, Mr. Bastianelli, can I ask you, so are your comments suggesting that you think public ownership is not a good idea generally, or are you really saying that the model of having the selectmen as water commissioners is not a good idea?
What I am suggesting to you at the moment is I think that you are all moving way too fast for your own good. I think that there's way more thought and consideration that needs to be put into it. I think that even just by the fact that you're saying our selectmen will be our water commissioners is a red flag. It just tells me, from what I know, you're going in the wrong direction. You've done a great analysis. The analysis has its holes on both sides of the coin, from Aquarian and from the town. But the bigger picture is you want to purchase and run this municipal water source. And there's a lot of things that I haven't heard discussed or considered in that consideration to buy it. It's one thing to buy it, it's another thing to operate it, and then I've also heard tonight, which is another point, is the responsibility that goes with it. I don't think you're going to be able to simply bond it. I don't think that financial analysis is going to work. There's too much complication with the 30% or 36% of water being serviced to another town. This is unprecedented in the Commonwealth. I think that that's going to bring up a whole legal issue that's going to take a lot of time. So I understand where you're coming from. I lived in the town for 50 years. They went through this analysis several times. You have a good starting point. You've got good ground underneath you. It needs more analysis. It's not something that, in my opinion, those articles shouldn't go to town meeting floor. It's way premature. And I know everybody in this room has worked hard. I know all these people have spent time and effort. I know what it's like. I spent 12 years on a board. But I think that you're rushing to judgment too quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Andy?
What town you served on?
Pembroke.
And what was your background?
I'm a civil engineer by degree, and I'm a private business owner. I run a multi-million-dollar company. But I've been an elected official, water commissioner, DPW commissioner in the town of Pembroke for 12 years.
Thank you.
Additional comments on this article? I'm looking for folks who haven't spoken yet. Tom?
Tom Carey, 1131 Main Street in South Hingham. I had the privilege of sitting where you all are for a number of years myself, and I commiserate with you getting a big thing like this dumped in your laps. You can be encouraged by the fact that the people who have spent the most time on this project on behalf of the town for years read like a who's who Hall of Fame of former members of the advisory committee. You know them, and you know that they are working solely on the basis of what they perceive as the best interest of the townspeople. In making your judgments, as we all make judgments, you take into account the interests of people who are making the argument, and what their motives are and what their incentives are. We have heard apparently that these citizens of Hingham have been bullying a multi-million-dollar corporation. I don't believe that for a minute. We have heard that the town has all its facts wrong. In fact, that's not a new charge. We heard that for years in the court litigation, that we had it all wrong. I participated in the tail end of that, representing one of the people representing the town. I no longer represent the town. I'm not on the clock. I'm here as a citizen. They argued that the contract price should be $192 million, fought it all the way to the highest levels. We said 60, something like that. The court came down 88.5 as of the valuation date, end of 2013. That was upheld. So what do? They turn around and tell us it's a bad deal. You're overpaying. Mind you, the court knocked over $100 million off of the contract price they were seeking, but they would now have you think that you're wasting your money, you shouldn't spend it. I would rely, personally, on the considered judgment of the people representing the town and working for the advisory committee, who've looked at this hard and said the numbers work. What are we getting? So, to my mind, the financial issue, this is a good deal for the town. We get 275 acres or more of land in Hingham. We get a water treatment plant that the town itself, that Aquarian itself valued in the litigation as being worth $65 million. And we get Ackerd Pond, Fulling Mill Pond, and the aquifer underlying where all the wells are being pumped. They themselves say that the pond, Ackerd, or Accord, depending on how you pronounce things, and Fulling Mill Pond, have 270 million gallons of water when fully charged. And it gets recharged from the heavens every year. And one of the assets we get is the franchise. We will be the ones with the right to use and distribute all of that water in perpetuity, which keeps replenishing itself. So it's a good deal, it's a good price. When I first came to Hingham, my parents dragged me down here. Bob Curley will say, there he goes again, we're getting the clan's history. But let me just mention that the house I live in, same one I was in 55, it has Ackerd Brook running right beside it. Cuts through the back of my land. Last half of my lot is wetlands. Most of the area around me is wetlands. Across the street, Joe Marziani was farming the Marziani fields for Pushcart Farm. Benny Marziani was running a laundry, and they took the money from the brook, they washed the clothes, and they dumped the water back into Ackerd Brook. That only lasted for a few years, and that stopped. 30 years later, I put an addition on my house, and I spent $30,000 to raise the land that I used to grow vegetables on up 4 feet to protect the water in Ackerd Brook. Today, our regulations are even stronger. I grumbled a little about the 30, but I won't complain a bit about the sharing the price of 100 whatever million in order to preserve and protect this priceless asset. And I don't need someone from Connecticut telling me not to trust the officials in Hingham to do a good job when 95% of the communities are doing it publicly, and where their precious award was shared by 16 public water systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Additional speakers? Is there someone who'd like to speak who has not yet had an opportunity? Ms. Rowe? Oh, I'm so sorry. May I ask you to wait? I didn't see Laura.
Laura Burns, 479 Main Street. A lot has been said earlier about the risks of taking on the water company, but as you just heard, the vast majority of towns in Massachusetts are served by public water companies. Less than 2% of the population. I didn't figure this all out. I learned this from the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee, so they can inform you better on this. But less than 2% of the population of Massachusetts is served by private water, and our service area A makes up rather a large chunk of that 2%. And in those towns that this also comes from research by Selectman Johnson, she researched the cohort of 41 towns that are roughly our size. And out of 41 towns, our size in Massachusetts, one of them is served by a private water company. That's us. And of the other 40, in 39 of them, the selectmen or the mayors are the water commissioners. And the risks of that come with the responsibility of taking care of the health and welfare of the people served by those public water companies are being assumed, and those responsibilities being carried out on a daily basis in towns our size by selectmen and by mayors all across the Commonwealth. This is something that they can do and are doing it. Something was said about the risks of the amount that needs to be put into maintenance, that we need deep pockets to address even the risks of climate change to our water system, and that's true.
But what we must remember is that we pay for the maintenance no matter who owns the water company. If Aquarian does maintenance, we pay for it in our rates. If the town does the maintenance, we pay for it in our rates. But I think Mr. Ferlat has left, I'm sorry. I was delighted to hear him say that it's all about the infrastructure and you can't kick the can down the road, because that is my main reason for feeling that we need to buy this water treatment system. One of the residents of Hull said we have the very best water company. But another resident from Hull mentioned that it is public knowledge, and it is, that the water system in Hull is in very poor repair. How can we have the very best water company if the water system in Hull is in very poor repair? So one of the things that the study committee, and you've probably heard this because you've been to some of the forums, learned is that Aquarian has done, in the last decade, they've done 3 capital studies about what mains they should be repairing and taking care of the system. And those studies have recommended a certain amount of reinvestment in the infrastructure, and Aquarian has only been spending half what is recommended by their own studies that they paid for. You can't kick the can down the road. And that is why I think we need to recoup the money that we are currently sending out of town to pay for out-of-town shareholders, or the money that we are spending to pay commercial borrowing rates when we could use our AAA bond rating to do that, and reinvest that money in the infrastructure that Aquarian has not been properly maintaining. I think that I also think it's a bit odd to refer to a unidirectional comment. I don't know about, I deleted Facebook about 6 months ago. I strongly recommend it. So I don't know about that. All I do know is that up from 2013 till last July, Aquarian has spent $2.7 million to get their point of view out to our people. The Board of Selectmen's budget for advertising their proposal to the town is zip, except maybe extra janitorial services for the forum, perhaps. But I don't think that the town has had this discussion all its way, and I think that we need to buy the system so that it can be maintained properly going forward, because the real risk is that we stay with private ownership that doesn't maintain the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burns. Ms. Rowe?
Again, Polly Rowe, Rockview Road, Hull, former longtime Hingham resident. I would like to state 3 facts for the record. Number 1, under Hingham town ownership, Hull residents, and in fact all water customers in all 3 towns, will completely lose what they currently have in terms of, number 1, a contractual agreement with the water company. Number 2, protection from the DPU in terms of rates. Some of us clearly remember Situate, municipally owned, suddenly raised their rates by 20%. Nobody knew anything about it or had any input in it. And number 3, no protection from the Massachusetts Attorney General. I would like to read, first for people who may have forgotten, from the Hingham 2012 Town Warrant, the following paragraph. And this goes to the fact and reality-based fears that water customers, and particularly those in Hull, have. Development of the South Hingham Industrial Park area is a town priority because it is low-impact growth that has the potential to yield significant long-term commercial tax revenue for the town. In fiscal year 2011, the town collected $4.3 million in commercial property taxes. While there is high potential for existing business expansion and new development in the industrial park area, having adequate water and sewer infrastructure is a prerequisite for any further economic development. It may also be necessary to ensure that existing businesses wishing to expand are not forced to relocate. As a Hull resident, I want to make sure that the bills, the rates, the money that I'm paying for quality, safe, reliable water are not going to be spent on the development of South Hingham, but that I will get as a Hull resident proper due priority to address our aging infrastructure. The last comment I would like to read from one of my earlier rough drafts is the following, and I'm stating this to the March 9th Hingham Selectmen's Public Information presentation. I had professional commitments in town all weekend, so if I've missed a meeting, I always watch it online on the video. On March 9th, as a result of the persistent public pressure from Hull residents, both questioning the enforcement of rules and regulations and our legal recourse to address future problems, and challenging the lack of a written tri-town contractual agreement to spell out in detail the complexities and liabilities in the inherent takeover, Selectwoman Karen Johnson publicly stated that Hingham would now provide, quote, written assurance. Totally aside from whatever will or won't be contained in such, quote, written assurance, this is the third policy decision change just since September 2018. A day one governance model, by its very definition, means that the selectmen are not prepared to run the water system. And after watching that video, I made 2 phone calls. One of which was to a Hingham friend of mine here whose career has been a municipal water expert, an attorney. I was told that whatever, quote-unquote, written assurance we will be given will absolutely not hold up in a court of law. And I have the tape firmly planted in my brain from hearing Richard Norman repeatedly say, industry expert, things don't ever go as planned, and what matters is what you have written. Secondly, I call the Attorney General's, having heard how many times that 96% of the 351 communities in the Commonwealth have their own water system. I thought certainly there must be boilerplate guidelines about things. And I wanted to find out where I stood as a Hull resident. And I was told, quote unquote, by the Attorney General's office has no jurisdiction and no expertise in that matter. And I had just heard Ms. Johnson address one of the Hull residents' concern about what do we do when problems arise. We can look at the DEP rules, we can come before the Hingham Board of Selectmen, we can go to the Attorney General. There's reasons why I have fear as a Hull resident, and I'm not alone. And I respectfully ask that this committee fully acknowledge that those fears are based in reality and need to be addressed before you consider moving forward. Thank you.
Ms. Rowe? Anyone who has not spoken who would like to speak? Yes, sir?
Madam Chairman, Jim O'Hare, 11 Heron Way in Hingham. Madam Chairwoman, and members of the Advisory Committee, the Board of Selectmen, and the members of the WCASC, perhaps, I hope I'm right. I've expressed to most of you, both verbally and in writing, my concerns pertaining to the risks that I think the town will assume by purchasing the Hingham Aquarian Water Company. So rather than go on and reiterate most of the pros or the cons that have been expressed so far, I think there have been 2 really germane points that have been made tonight. One has been the rate of inflation that the water company says it was 1.9% since 2002 to the present time. This is considerably below almost all other rates of inflation. The national rate of inflation has been someplace between 2.5% and 3%. Our taxes in this town have been higher than that. The cost of an automobile has gone up over this period of time in excess of that. Almost everything. That is a very interesting number. That was disputed by another individual here in the town, and it was disputed from the point of view of the DPU. Obviously, one of those numbers is wrong. I think the 1.9 number is correct. Secondly, the individual who spoke rather forcefully concerning his experience in managing and running the water company in a neighboring town. I think he really has a handle. I don't think he has a vested interest. My vested interest is to vote no on this proposal. I think this acquisition is difficult. I think the points that he made are very, very relevant. This is a tough deal. Most corporate acquisitions are made by managements who are in a similar business, who think they understand the assets and the products that they're buying. The history is not good in that arena. It's a very, very difficult transition. And here we are in this town trying to do exactly the same thing with an unproven, untried management group. It's going to be tough. We have to do a lot of hiring. We're going to have a lot of new debt, something on the order between interest, principal, and the required maintenance of $250 million over the next 30 years. Our current debt is just a little over $68 million. That's a big increase that we're passing down the line. So, in conclusion, I would urge you to vote no on this. I think it's premature. I don't think we have the expertise, and I don't think we can acquire it in this short period of time to manage this. I defer to the comments made by the previous speaker, 2 speakers ago, who does do this. Thank you very much.
Mr. O'Hare, can I ask, I mean, there have been a number of towns that have taken over private operations even in recent years. From my understanding, those have been successful. I mean, maybe I'm not fully informed, but do you have concerns that, I mean, do you doubt that they've done it, or do you think their situations are different? I mean, how do you distinguish those cases?
That's a very good question. I don't have the actual facts of the towns. I know the transitions have taken place. I do think they've been smaller companies. I know that one of the towns that has been spoken about is Hyannis, and was referred to as the gold standard. They have had problems down there. They are in lawsuits because of PFAS and the other FOS that is gone into the water supply. I think that's a risk that we're assuming. Do we have those problems? We have Bear Cove Park, we have Wampatuck, we have a long history in the shipyard. Who is going to assume these unknown risks? We have risks of management, we have risks of the finance, and frankly, we have good water at this time in Hingham. The question I might want to know is, when other companies were taken over, were they taken over because the quality of the water was inferior and people said, why not do this? In other words, we have good water, so we're going to assume that we're going to make a transition and it's going to work. That doesn't work in the corporate sector, as I mentioned before, all that often. It's a difficult transition. It requires management, financing, vision, a cultural change. We'll have a cultural situation here. We have one management and we're going to another management. So I would have to answer your question, I would have to know more about that. I'm not a utility analyst or a utility expert. I just know, in general, that's a tough deal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We have several more warrant articles to review tonight, so I'm going to take Mr. Walsh, and then I'm going to ask if one more person who is in favor wants to speak, and then I'm going to suggest that we move on.
Again, John Walsh, Vice President of Operations for Aquarion. I just wanted to address some comments related to the rate making and DPU process. First of all, I'll say that the Attorney General's office is also involved in our rate cases. A number of years ago, legislation was passed so they could intervene, and they do in all our rate case proceedings. Regarding the idea that we, in our test year, the year before we go into a rate case, that we load in expenses. That is not correct. We do not do that. And it also presumes that the folks from the Attorney General's office and the DPU would miss that. In this last rate case, we had nearly 1,000 written questions to answer on a wide variety of topics. And then I think we had 4 days of testimony under oath in front of both the AG's office attorneys and the DPU. So the presumption here is that they would miss that we threw a bunch of expenses into our test year. That does not happen, and they would not miss that. And regarding our capital spending, there was no big spike in 2016. This is a presentation I did on January 19th. It's on our website. It shows that between 2014 and 18, we spent between $2.2 and $3.6 million in each of those years. And 2016 is right in the middle of that, about $2.3 million a year. So there was no, go ahead. Sure.
So the chart that we've seen, and I'm sure you're
Yes.
know the one I'm referring to, you're saying that's inaccurate?
That chart, which is in a interrogatory answer that we provided, that chart has, first of all, in 2016, it has a project that's about 2,300 feet that was done in 2015. The project was paved. There was a project in Hull. It was paved in 2016. So from an accounting perspective, it was closed out in 2016, and it ended up in the spreadsheet that we used to come up with those numbers. It ended up as a 2016 project. So the work was done in 2015, but
so, again, not to get off into the DPU.
Sure.
But so was that counted in the test year then or not?
Well, it doesn't, whether it was in 2015 or 16, that's capital spending, not expense. So the capital, whether it got recorded in 2015 or 16, from a rate case perspective, it doesn't matter. It's just as of the time we file, what projects have been what's called used and useful. So that project was used and useful by the time we filed for the rate case.
So it didn't matter what year?
Correct. It didn't matter what year. And there was a project that was double counted. 2,700 feet, we installed a new raw water transmission main on South Pleasant Street, and it was double counted in there. So the end result, and off the top of my head, don't quote me on this, but it's around 3,300 feet that was installed in 2016. So.
Just to follow up on that, Mr. Walsh, so if the spike in 2016 you're suggesting should be lower and 15 should be higher.
Correct.
So the second point that I took away from that chart at least was that there was a persistent underspending against a target that your studies had recommended. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I've seen that slide, and that shows the 1% or 10,000 feet. We do not have a target for 10,000 feet. Our KNEW model, which for everyone's sake, I won't get into a lot of detail on that, but the end result of our KNEW model was a recommendation that we invest a certain amount of main, which comes up to, in today's dollars, I think about $2.7 million a year I'll be more specific, adding another $1 million a year of water main replacement. That is our target. And that target is based, the 1% is a rule of thumb that people use in the industry. It is, you don't want to base decisions on a rule of thumb. That's why we did the KNEW model. That KNEW model is all based on the proposed or the recommended amount of water main replacement every year is an output that, I don't know how to describe this. It keeps our water main break rate within a certain reasonable range. So we're investing enough every year so that in future decades we don't see a big spike in water main breaks and thus a big need to all of a sudden replace water mains. So I'd glad to discuss it offline with the KNEW model.
Carrie? I'm sorry, Mr. Walsh, you finished?
I just wanted to add one thing regarding, there was a comment about the appeals. And our attorney for that whole process is back here, so if I get it wrong, I'm sure he might correct me. We were okay with what the trial court came out with. The town appealed to the appeals court. We cross-appealed to preserve our rights. There's enough attorneys in the room to know if I said something there incorrect, but that's my understanding. And then the appeals court agreed with the trial court. We were fine with that, and the town appealed to the Superior Court, to the Supreme Court. So we were fine with the trial, the outcome of the trial court. So.
Thank you, sir.
May I?
Sure. Just a moment, I'm gonna,
I just wanted to ask John.
I'd like to hear from John, from Carrie first, and then.
Okay.
Does that work?
Sure.
Kerry Ryan, counsel for the town. I just wanted to address some of the DPU issues because I realize I was in the hearings for the town and none of you were there, I don't think, and in fact, I'm pretty convinced nobody here in this audience other than people from Aquarian were there. In general, there were no participants from the public at the hearings, and so I'm a little afraid that there may be a misperception. Number one, the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office does participate in the DPU hearings. In fact, the Attorney General's office brought witnesses, expert witnesses, to testify contrary to Aquarian's requested rate increases. The Attorney General's office brought Attorney General internal people in to testify against Aquarian's rate increases. The Attorney General's office worked hand in hand with the attorneys from both Hingham and Hull in all of the DPU proceedings. And so this idea somehow that the Attorney General was just all happy. In fact, the Attorney General currently is opposing the motion for reconsideration that is pending at the DPU still. The DPU allowed a surcharge of an additional 2%, what's called MRAM, which is concerning the mains replacement. The Attorney General strongly urged the DPU not to grant that. And then when Aquarian requested that it be moved to 3% in a motion for reconsideration, the Attorney General is currently still opposing that. One of the other things is on the two charts. I'm a little afraid that the chart that you previously saw, which was the main replacement, which I think, David, you may have asked about, was the one that showed the spike in 2016. That is a main replacement chart. The other numbers that Mr. Walsh referred to up here, I believe, were capital expenditures. They're two different things. They're related, of course, but we're talking about two different things. The chart you were showed with the bars that you were specifically referencing was main replacements. And so I just wanted to make sure all of the chart that you were talking about there with the main replacements is from the DPU hearings. And I do not recall anything in the DPU hearings where that chart was asked to be changed, that somehow there was some double counting that went on, because that is something you would bring to the DPU's attention and you would submit a new exhibit. I don't remember that. It's possible it occurred, but I do not remember that ever happening. Thank you.
Andy, did you want to ask a question?
Well, my question was just answered. My question was going to be, what was the Attorney General's position at the last rate hearing? And Ryan answered.
Yeah,
it,
I didn't mean to suggest that the Attorney General was in agreement. The Attorney General's attorney questioned me significantly on our KNU model. I think everything that Attorney Ryan just described shows people the robustness of that process. They question us for 4 days on the stand. They don't leave many stones unturned, and the process works well for the customers.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Walsh.
you.
I said I would take, Mary?
Good evening, Mary Power for the Board of Selectmen. Just a couple of points. I think it's probably clear from what you've all heard tonight that over the last 6 years, the town and the current owners of the water company agree on very little. You've heard a lot of dueling statistics and numbers, And I would just say that the presentation that the board gave you last week, and we thank you for that opportunity, we stand behind the information and the facts, and I would hope that between now and Wednesday before you vote, you might want to take an opportunity to watch that and remind yourself of the town's story. That way we don't have to tell it again tonight, because I know you still have a few warrant articles to go through. I'd make 3 points, please. First of all, in 2012, the town didn't undertake this effort because it didn't have enough to do or it would be a feather in our cap. It was over a period of time of serious concerns with respect to ownership, maintenance of the water delivery infrastructure, continued ownership changes, and high water rates that weren't translating into the caliber of services that residents in this area have come to appreciate. We looked, and if you look on the HMLP website, one of the things on their website, they say the town has introduced electric lighting for the benefit of its citizens, and neither to make money at their expense nor to furnish light at less than cost. And that was the premise for Hingham Light founding itself in 1895. And we looked and said, if this is good for electricity, maybe we should explore this with water. And I think that the experience that the town has had with HMLP speaks for itself. I just close, you've had a lot of numbers. I think of a story that encapsulates to me why we're doing this. Aquarian has commissioned capital studies over the years, and there are recommendations for water main replacements. And in 2005, 2011, and 2014, there was a stretch of Downer Avenue that continued to be one of the high priority water main replacement projects. And in fact, from 2005 to 2011, the stretch of road that was recommended for water main replacement got a little bit bigger in 2014. About a month ago, there was a water main break on Downer Avenue. Surprise. And because Foster School was affected, the repair was scheduled to take place after hours so that it wouldn't disrupt the school. The repair began about 5:30. There were also some homes in the area that were affected. And during the night, the town, we get updates on this, because we have a responsibility to many things in this town. And when a water main breaks, we feel a sense of responsibility. At about 8:30 or 9 o'clock that night, we got an email saying that the repair was taking longer than expected, in part because of the cold weather. And for a very brief period of time, there was a question in the town's mind about whether this could be completed by morning, and whether we might have to relocate 600 children in a school. Now, fortunately, that wasn't the case. But what's interesting is you say to yourself, why wasn't it replaced in 2005? Why wasn't it replaced in 2011? Why wasn't it replaced in 2014? Our water company was owned by 3 different owners. During 17 years, we've had 3 different owners. And by the way, during that 10-year period of time, when Downer Avenue was ignored 3 times, our water rates grew by 40%. It just doesn't add up. Thank you.
Mr. Kyle?
I'm going to be very brief. My name is Tom Piles, 727 Main Street. I just wanted to remind everybody why we're here and give a little bit of a historic perspective. Literally 7 years ago, around this time, this body recommended that we create a study group to review the water company and its possible acquisition. And the reason was that we were very concerned about rates and where they were going and the infrastructure and how we were going to spend money. I don't believe that that has changed. I think we're still concerned about those 2 issues. And for that reason, in 2012, at your recommendation, town meeting approved the setup of the Water Acquisition Study Group. They've done a terrific job, and I think, in my mind, proven that we can do this from a financial standpoint, and as importantly, we can do this like 340 other towns. it isn't a risk in my mind. If 340 other towns can do it, we can do it. So I would just ask you to reconsider. Now, I know that none of you were there in 2012, but it was your predecessors that approved this and recommended to town meeting, and I hope you will do it the same this year. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay. With that, I'd like to move along to our discussion of the next article, which we are still fondly calling by its alphabet name, NN, and it concerns the Board of Water Commissioners. And Victor, do I?
So that, I think Bob is going to take the lead.
And the fact that all of his colleagues is leaving the room, it doesn't mean anything.
Means it's been a long meeting. Article NN, Nancy. This article asks the town of Hingham to vote to authorize its Board of Selectmen to act as a Board of Water commissioners pursuant to statutory authority or other applicable laws, and in conjunction with that, for the authority to hire a superintendent and to enter into all contracts necessary to manage and operate the water system. So my comments are going to be directed to the near term and to the midterm, and I don't have any crystal ball about the long term. But in the near term, first of all, this article and the next two articles all assume that Article MM has been passed by a 2/3 vote. These articles become irrelevant if the town does not vote to acquire the water company. So, assuming that the town votes to acquire the water company, really at this time, in terms of its management and control, the only option is for the Board of Selectmen to be in charge. The statute, Mass General Laws, Chapter 40, Section 39E, basically provides two statutory options. One is to have the Board of Selectmen act as the Board of Water Commissioners, or two, to have elected water commissioners as provided in another statute that governs how elections are conducted. Now, our town election, of course, happens on the Saturday after the first night of town meeting. None of us actually know the position of these articles in the warrant. At this point in time, we don't even know whether there'll be a vote before the election is held. But there is no way we can hold an election for water commissioners consistent with the requirements of Massachusetts law and the town in time to have an option that is different from having the Board of Selectmen act as water commissioners. Now, both Aaron Kelly and myself independently examined the data concerning the 41 cities and towns with similar-sized water systems to Hingham, identified in the Ty and Bond Massachusetts Water Rate Survey. And a review of those governance structures essentially indicated that in almost all, the vast majority, the management of the water company was vested in the executive authority, either in the Board of Selectmen of the town or the mayor of a city. Most often, there was a licensed and qualified person who was most often called a water superintendent, who was in charge of the day-to-day running of the water systems in those various communities. There were two water districts. One had appointed water commissioners by each of the communities involved in the water districts, and another had elected water commissioners. So our review of what seemed to be the relevant data indicated that having elected water commissioners is the rare bird. It is not a common way of operating. That does not mean it should be necessarily ruled out. As has often been remarked in public meetings in the town of Hingham, we study things, and I think as a result of a lot of the listening that went on in the course of all of the public hearings related to these issues, the form of governance in the midterm for a water system is something that can be studied. And issues that can be addressed would include, should there be elected water commissioners or not? What does the data say beyond what we've already looked at, if anything? Should there be a water district? Should the town think about management with its own employees of the water system rather than using a contract operator? In most of the cities and towns we looked at, more often than not, the water system is a division of the Department of Public Works, and the day-to-day work is done by town employees. That is something that is probably worthy of study in the future. And we have other town examples of this. For example, both the Sewer Commission and the Country Club, South Shore Country Club, originally had contract operators. Both eventually became run by town employees, I think most people perceive to the great benefit of the town. So because of this, it is the present thinking, and it is anticipated will be part of the recommendation for Article NN, that there be established a transition and evaluation committee with members appointed by both the Board of Selectmen and the town moderator to study these and such other issues as they might deem appropriate with respect to the good governance of a town water system and to otherwise assist in the transition efforts of the town. The Board of Selectmen aren't going to be the day-to-day operators of the water system. What the Board of Selectmen do is they act as the executive authority. They hire the police chief. They hire the fire chief. They hire people like Randy Sylvester, who has the licenses needed to run a water company. They hire town administrators. They select and vet appropriate people to be in these positions. And why would we expect that there would be anything other than that done with respect to the hiring of a superintendent, the formulation of an RFP for a contract operator, the vetting of a contract operator, and the ultimate hiring of people that are going to deliver a quality water system to the town of Hingham. I think one last thing I'll talk about is that this article also contemplates a recommendation concerning a Citizens Advisory Board, which would be comprised of 5 members, 3 from the town of Hingham, 1 from Hull, and 1 from North Cohasset, so that citizens would have fellow citizens of their towns, communities, their neighbors, that they could go to with respect to issues that arise out of the operation of the water system. That Citizen Advisory Board can interact with the superintendent, and of course there could be direct access to the superintendent. Beyond that, there's access to the Board of Selectmen. Beyond that, there's access to the Department of Environmental Protection. There are lots of public venues for addressing issues with a locally owned water company. And it is my understanding that when Selectman Johnson referred to the involvement of the Attorney General, that she was looking at the Attorney General as a stage of the process that was even over and above the DEP, rather than the first line of inquiry with respect to issues that would arise under the water system. So that's, I think, my overview of Article NN. And I'm
Questions from my colleagues? Nancy?
Thank you, Bob. I have, this one is of particular interest to me, and I have two questions on it. One is, as you so accurately state, Hingham likes to study. So is there a plan for how we know when the study committee is done and that we have come to a conclusion?
Well, I think there's kind of a natural timeline here in that, again, I think because of listening, it is contemplated that the original contract with a contract operator will be for the general period of 3 to 5 years. So that the town is going to be contractually bound, I suppose, absent some discharge for cause of a contract operator, to a period of at least 3 years. And one would think that a transition and evaluation committee would probably be having regular reporting on where they are to the Board of Selectmen, but I would think would probably want to, within 6 months of whenever a contract is up, my personal view, the Board of Selectmen haven't weighed in on this, but something along those lines would be the kind of timeline I think we'd be looking at.
Can I ask one? Yep. When you talk about the Citizens Advisory Board, are they a listening committee, or will they have some sort of ability to actually make change, or are they just accumulating data to pass on?
I would expect, as with our committee and with other committees, that they would be able to have the water superintendent perhaps make a regular report to them. Okay. I mean, for example, the Country Club Management Committee has a superintendent's report every time they meet. The Water Supply Committee has folks from Aquarian come in. And I would think it would be up to that committee to establish a regular meeting and reporting schedule once they're organized.
Okay, thank you. This is good change, so thank you.
Additional questions from my colleagues? One's not that substantive, but I guess between you and I, because you have this article and I have the transition costs on PP, we just need to make sure that we clarify that, because I know in PP it's a financial transition period. So when I initially read this, I said, well, wait, the timeline that you've targeted for beginning and end, I think both of our timelines start at the same place, which is town meeting vote. But the financial end for PP is when the debt gets issued, whereas in yours, I believe you noted it's when the DEP registration is, did it say it was transferred, or, I'm trying to think of your exact language that you used.
When the registration is transferred.
Right. So
yes.
Your transition period in this is different than mine, so we just need to make sure we're careful with the language.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little the other night. And it was a slightly different issue with Article PP.
Yeah.
Because, as you pointed out, the short-term financing was coming in so that the money was going to be available, so that the financial transition period is different from the regulatory one.
Correct.
Where the town isn't actually in operation until the registration is transferred and everything that goes along with that happens.
So I just don't want there to be a confusion for a reader as to if we define it differently in different articles.
We can certainly look at some other language.
And then the other question that I had is looking at the Citizens Advisory Committee with 5 members. I think, was it, Victor, did you say there's several hundred?
I
connections in North Cohasset.
300 or so, something like that.
So I just wonder, like, if, just say somebody from North Cohasset's not willing to, or doesn't want to be, whether it's willingness or ability to be on that committee, would the goal be to have those 5 slots filled, so then somebody from maybe Hull would get 2, since they have, I mean, they've got almost, they got more than 50% actually of what we have in Hingham. So, I mean, would that be something that could be contemplated as we're crafting this article?
I think Karen Johnson has an answer that may supersede mine, but.
Yeah, so quick answer. We spoke with Chris Senior and Diane Kennedy, who's a member of the Board of Selectmen in Cohasset, and particularly Chris Senior over time, I think, as we've told you, they are in full support of this acquisition, and Diane is in full support of recommending somebody to the Hingham Board of Selectmen, who would in turn be appointed by the Hingham Board of Selectmen to the Citizens Advisory Board. So I think, at least in the short term, I don't think that's an issue.
So there's somebody that we know that we're going to have a willing person from North Cohasset to be on the.
That's the assurance that I've received from both the town manager and a member of the Board of Selectmen.
Okay.
So it's on the appointments from the Hull and Cohasset people, the expectation is the Hingham Board of Selectmen would appoint them, or their?
My expectation is that the Hull Board of Selectmen and the Cohasset Board of Selectmen will recommend representatives to the Citizens Advisory Board to the Hingham Water Commissioners, and that the Hingham Board of Selectmen, sitting as the Water Commissioners, would make the appointment to the Citizens Advisory Board.
Additional questions from my colleagues?
Yeah, I have a question. So Bob, or whichever member of the subcommittee is in the best position to answer this. Going out beyond the period immediately following the acquisition, did the subcommittee give any consideration to, you mentioned a water district, the pros and cons of forming a water district?
Only as one of the potential forms of governance for water systems in Massachusetts.
And what were those pros and cons?
No, I didn't say pros and cons. I said only as one of the forms.
Oh, well, what I'm asking is whether the subcommittee considered the pros and cons of that.
We did not address the pros and cons of a water district. I think that was beyond the scope of what we were charged to do. And that would be something that would be a separate area of study. I've read the statutes dealing with water districts. Not prepared to give an essay answer on that, but I know they're out there, and they are multiple community ways to run a water system. There are a couple of them within the 41 communities. They're down on Cape Cod, Mashpee.
My understanding, Eric, and I'm sure the selectmen will correct me if I have this wrong, is that for a water district, they're typically, and perhaps required, where each municipality is contributing something to the, well, in this case, water. And here, the sort of one issue you'd have to deal with is Hingham, if it took over the system, would own the entire system. So there really wouldn't be a district to set up. So that's, but yeah, Bob is correct. We did not do an analysis of water districts versus other forms of governance beyond that understanding.
Well, and I think that may begin to answer my next several questions. There's any number of ways to run a railroad here. The general the general laws include a model Water and Sewer Commission
Right, sure.
Act, Chapter 40N, which can be applied to multiple towns at once. There's the possibility of going to the legislature to get special legislation. There's the question of who ought to be the water commissioners. If the water commissioners are going to be somebody other than the Board of Selectmen, there's the question whether they ought to be elected or appointed. Did the subcommittee consider the pros and cons of any of those options?
We did not. We identified them. We did not go into discussion. The thought was that under the timing here, that if the town wanted to proceed and acquire the water company now, that the default position has to be that the selectmen would be the water commissioners in the short term.
Sure.
Because they're the folks who've, well, they have the statutory authority, even if we don't vote this article. And they're frankly the ones in town who've been doing the most work on this, right? But that is why, I mean, the points you're raising are the reasons that I was supportive of the idea of having a study with I initially wanted a short-term response back to town meeting of a moderator-appointed committee to look into these governance issues. I think during discussion, I take the point, which I think is a valid one, that going to the next town meeting with such a response is not feasible, that there should be a longer time frame to see how it works. I also take the point that the initial plan was to have a transition committee to recommend to the water commissioners, the selectmen, operational matters, how to set things up. And we don't want to have a multiplicity of committees, so it makes a sense to combine the governance review with the other transitional reviews. So hence, I think I agree with the idea of having one committee, but I still think that it's a review of governance looking into all the things that you're suggesting is necessary, and I do think that there should be a moderator appointment to that, a moderator control of the appointments to that. Certainly selectmen can have nominations as well, but I think there needs to be a broader scope, and I would say that the report should be back to the town meeting at some point. I'm not sure what the exact date should be, but.
And a somewhat related question. So I noticed in one of the letters that Aquarian sent to us, I think it was the first one, dated February 26th, a comment to the effect that they questioned the legality of the town of Hingham running a water utility for substantially the entire town of Hull. Did the subcommittee drill down into what they were getting at there, and what's that all about?
I had discussions with council about that, and I've read the Chapter 139 of the Acts of 1879, which it was in hand script in Old English. And the specific statutory language that the legislature used when it gave the town the right to buy the water system was that it could manage, improve, and control said water system by such, quote, officers, servants, or agents as the town may direct, end quote. So I think either directly under that legislative act or pursuant to Chapter 40, Section 39E, or through their inherent executive authority, the selectmen would be legally the ones charged with operating the water system.
Did anybody ask Aquarian what they meant by that question about questioning the legality? To understand if there's something that we might not have thought of?
Sounds like Mr. Pedoni wants to.
Mr. Petroni?
Richard Pedoni, 12 Newtown Drive. I'm also counsel to Aquarian. So when I took a look at the structure that was being proposed in discussions before the actual warrant articles were drafted, I said, how can this be governed? Because it is unprecedented for one town to manage a system in another. We've got the statute, which contains the language that Mr. Curley quoted. And then you have layers and layers of statutory rules for how towns act, how towns insure themselves, how towns are protected for immunity, and how towns operate how selectmen can operate. We've got a home rule amendment to the Constitution that came after that statute. And I said to myself, you've got those couple words buried there, preceding all of those statutes. This is a big question mark. Do those words actually survive in light of everything else? And I came up with the conclusion I did not see a clear answer. And so I posed the question very early on in this process, and I realized we should actually also put the question and ask for the documents, what does the town have in the public records requests that we put forward? And what we've learned is the town has, and we had finance questions as well, we learned the town has a 2-page summary opinion on finance issues. What we learned in our discussions concerning the public records request is the town does not have a legal opinion on these issues. The town does not have one. We asked for one. Maybe it has oral opinion from town council, but you're all going to be voting without a legal opinion on this issue, and the legislative body at town meeting is going to have to jump in and decide, based upon your recommendation and the lack of study, and those words in the statute superseded by all of the other statutes, whether it works.
So, Mr. Pedoni, 2 things. I mean, so we did have this discussion at one of the subcommittee meetings, and we talked about how you say it's unprecedented, but there are communities, in fact, Hingham, as I understand it, sewer serves people in Cohasset, and there are other communities which serve people in other communities, granted, not to the extent here. So in that sense, it's not unprecedented, and you would think that the same legal issues that you're speculating about would apply there. Secondly, I mean, in terms of the bond counsel opinion, there is a written bond counsel opinion. Now, you had said at the subcommittee meeting that you didn't believe that that was a full opinion, that you would expect something, more elaborate. I went back and read it. I mean, it's an opinion. And my understanding is that bond counsel stands behind it. So I guess I am a little confused on that point.
In the corporate transactions I deal with, I see more reasoned opinions which acknowledge the existence of subsequent statutes, would acknowledge that there was on the bond financing, would have acknowledged that the charter specifies a specific type of financing that could be used here. That opinion does not even acknowledge the existence of specific financing in the town charter. And I don't think if I was doing a corporate transaction, I could take that opinion into a boardroom and say to my clients, based upon this opinion, which seems to have missed the statute that has a specific type of financing specifically authorized, if this goes sideways or it takes a year or 2 to close because this needs to be cleaned up, that lawyer is on the hook.
But
this is $100 million.
But it references the statute. I mean, I don't have it in front of me at the moment.
I agree, but it doesn't discuss that there's a specific financing mechanic that appears to be what the legislature in 1879 had in mind for how you finance this, nor does it say that the subsequent statutes undid that. So that was my view, and it remains my view that that's not the kind of opinion that I would take into a boardroom. And of course, that's a legal call for the town to make and for town meeting to make. But there is no opinion on governance, which was the question I stepped up for at all that I have seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the scale is unprecedented by a factor of it's a few hundred customers that I've seen in other towns, and the selectmen are now about to become commissioners for 13,000.
But why is that different, though? So if you say that you can't, that one town can't be the governing body for another town, so why does it matter whether you're talking about 10,000 people in the other town or 100 people in the other town? If it can't be done, it can't be done, yet it is done.
Sure. I think it's a risk assessment. Was anybody in any of those other 100 or 200 situations dissatisfied? They were probably in a situation where and has this been studied? And that's my assessment. I don't know the answer, but I would say it's an issue. If we're going to take on a $100 million obligation in the town, get a legal opinion that it can be done that way. Or do what everybody else does when you have multiple town systems on a large scale, form a district. That's my analysis. And thank you. And may I address one other point? Somewhat related. So there's a significant number of citizens in town that would like to see the questions being discussed be determined by ballot at town meeting. And so I'd just like to submit a copy of a partially complete petition with about 170 signatures that will also be submitted to the town moderator when it's complete. And we would just ask that the committee consider supporting these questions being determined by ballot at town meeting. Thank you. I'll pass it here.
Thank you for acknowledging that it's the moderator's call.
Thank you.
Two lawyers?
Two. You got one issue, I got the other. Two different
How
issues.
lucky can we get?
2 to 1. Anyway, we have two different issues.
Okay.
I'll take the first one. There was a comment that in the public record response from the town, which I've been dealing with, there have been a lot of public record requests, by the way, and so there's a lot of that. There was a comment that the town has not gotten legal advice on something. The town has gotten legal advice on a multitude of issues over the last 7 years. And amazingly, the town has also gone ahead and cited to its attorney-client privilege and not produced a multitude of records that are the attorney-client privileged records. And so the idea to stand here and state that the town has never gotten advice on something being legal is just not accurate, that the public record request has confirmed this. I just wanted to hit that in particular, and on a broader note, I would state for the committee that I would not get your legal advice from Aquarian's counsel.
John Coughlin, Town Council. I don't have a lot to add other than what Victor and what Bob had said before. We have looked at these issues. The Special Act has specific language in it that authorizes the town to buy Service Area A, which is the service area that Aquarian presently serves in the 3 towns. We have to buy the entire service area. We do not have an option to just buy the portion that's in Hingham. So the statute requires we buy the entire service area. It has specific language that we can manage that. And the town has looked at this. It's done in other towns on a different scale, granted. It's done in the Sewer Commission here in Hingham. So these issues have been looked at, and the town is comfortable that we can go forward.
Okay, thank you. Hold on. I'm taking questions from my committee members.
I just had a question, Bob. Is there a reason why we would have the report of the Transition and Evaluation Committee made to the Board of Selectmen as opposed to make it to town meeting?
First draft.
No, well, no, I mean, I'm not being critical, I just,
No, I mean,
I thought there might be some reason we don't make reports to town meeting. I don't know.
I'm here to listen tonight, and I think where they were going to be the appointing authority, it seemed to me that they would probably report back to the selectmen. I don't know that that's mandated, and certainly, you know, it could go to the town meeting if that's.
I'm not advocating, I just am offering it as a question, because I know sometimes I think I have seen committees, and I think Victor said a report to town meeting.
Sometimes there are reports to town meeting, but I would think that suppose there needs to be follow-on action. I think the proponents of that action are probably going to be the members of the Board of Selectmen. And so I mean, you can do almost anything as citizens in the town of Hingham. You can formulate warrant articles and do petitions, but I think the orderly way to do it would probably be to have any next steps be proposed by the committee and the Board of Selectmen.
Okay, that answers my question.
That's just my view.
No, you're the one that's been looking at this.
Any additional questions on this from my colleagues? Then I will take, hold on, I'm going to take comments or questions from citizens on this question. Ms. Rowe?
Polly Rowe, Rockview Row Hall. And just as a reminder, not to this board, but to people listening that Hull has no vote and no voice in the decisions that are going to get made on this. I have a question that I would appreciate if somebody could address this. I'm looking at an April 24th, 2013 Patriot Ledger article entitled Hingham Voters OK $3.7 million land purchase for sewer plant. And bottom lining it, the first paragraph reads, residents at town meeting Tuesday night voted to allocate $3.75 million to buy 18.6 acres of land for the construction of a sewage treatment plant meant to spur development in South Hingham. Next paragraph, the lots, I don't need to describe it. They were a site for controversial affordable housing project as recently as last year. But town officials said they were able to convince the developer, Avalon Bay, to allow the town to buy the land instead. Next paragraph, Selectman Bruce Rebuffo states this article is simply about commercial economic development. My question to you, since the Hingham Selectmen have not yet drafted a contractual agreement with the ratepayers in other towns, I'm speaking for Hull, and we have no idea what such a contractual agreement would include in it, how do I, as a Hull resident, have any guarantee? Reasonable assurance is one thing, guarantee is another, that if a former selectman negotiating a land deal, now we're talking about having the selectmen serve, even if it's for a short time, as water commissioners, what guarantee is there that such actions that won't happen again? I don't see that I have any guarantee that a selectman who wants to pursue a particular, for lack of a better word, agenda, can't then go as the water commissioner and influence the decisions there. Could you please address that?
Anybody want to speak to that? Kirk?
Kirk Schultz, 65 Prospect Street, chairman of the Hingham Board of Health. And at the time, I was chairman of the Comprehensive Master Wastewater Committee. So the actions that you just heard, the results of the committee being comprised of the Planning Board, the Conservation Commission, Board of Health, a selectman's representative, among other citizens of the town, came up with a recommendation in our Comprehensive Wastewater Master Plan, in which we would look to South Hingham for the purchase of land for the development of a regional sewer on-site disposal area. And I believe that Selectman Rebuffo, I'm sure of it, was acting on behalf of what the commission, the committee had put forward as a recommendation relative to the Comprehensive Master Wastewater Plan. So it wasn't a selectman decision. That was something that the entire town, through a number of boards and commissions, recommended, and that's how that particular warrant article for the purchase of that property came about. Thank you.
Mr. Healy.
Paul Healy. Just briefly, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's important to just remember that the Board of Selectmen does not permit development. That's done by the Planning Board, that's done by the ZBA, the Board of Health makes decisions which impact that as well, Conservation Commission. It is not the Board of Selectmen. And while the suggestion might, have some traction somewhere else, it bears no resemblance to the way anything is permitted in this town. And having served on the Hingham Planning Board for 19 years, I can tell you that we zealously guarded our prerogatives with respect to permitting and didn't take lightly having the thumb applied by anybody inclined to do so, including selectmen.
Anyone else? That's Mr. Carey. Okay. All right.
Richard Bedoni, 12 Newtown Drive. In response to Mr. Ryan's comments, I wasn't attempting to suggest that the town hadn't obtained legal advice and counsel. I certainly know the proponents have had plenty of advice on how they might be able to proceed. This is a corporate transaction, and what I'm saying is there should be a corporate-type legal opinion that says that the steps the town is doing, if they have risk, in what they are, and it should be a reasoned opinion that the voters at town meeting can rely upon. That's my assessment. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Carey?
This really isn't a tag team match. If we're interested in a good legal opinion, one might take a look at the decision that resulted from the years of litigation in which Aquarian raised every conceivable argument it could, one would think. That was a declaratory judgment. And this is the final judgment entered by the court after all appeals were exhausted. The water treatment plant, owned by defendant Aquarian Water Capital of Massachusetts, Inc., and its successors and assigns, must be sold to the plaintiff town of Hingham as part of the town's exercise of its rights to purchase the corporate property and all of the rights and privileges of the town's water company. Repeated again in a later page. The above formula is declared as the appropriate calculation for the plaintiff town of Hingham to purchase the corporate property and all of the rights and privileges of the town's water company from defendant Aquarian. And Bob can pull out, if need be, the simple language of the statute that makes it crystal clear that the rights and privileges of the water company are to sell water to the customers in these areas. This last-minute notion that somehow the sale is illegal or the operation under the rights given us by the court is illegal, really, for the lawyers in the crowd, sounds like something that should have been raised in the litigation.
Thank you, sir. Additional comments from the public on NN? Moving to OO.
Bob, that's you again.
OO.
Do you think they know what clicks on you?
Article 00 relates to the establishment of a water system enterprise fund. An enterprise fund is basically a method of municipal accounting that is authorized by state law that allows for all of the revenues and expenses from a given enterprise to be accounted for in one place. When an enterprise fund is established for the water system, all of the revenues of the water system would need to go into the enterprise fund and would need to stay there. So to the extent that there was a surplus within the revenues generated by the operation of the enterprise, that surplus would have to remain devoted to the water system. It could be used for accelerated capital improvements. It could be used to establish a rate stabilization fund so that any ups and downs in water rates could be smoothed out to the benefit of the persons of all of the ratepayers. The town has established an enterprise fund for the South Shore Country Club, and the Sewer Commission operates under a somewhat analogous special revenue fund where all of its revenues are devoted to the sewer system. This article also proposes an additional budget for the first year of operation of the water system, with the revenues projected that would be received by Aquarian as calculated from the rate case. And it's important to note that within that budget, there is a budgeted surplus of almost $5 million. The exact number is $4,867,883. And that amount will remain in the enterprise fund. Now, there's been a lot of different observations about ratepayers and taxpayers. And basically, the acquisition of the water system is being paid for by water rates, presumably water rates at lower rates than would otherwise be experienced by the ratepayers. There is only one hypothetical and probably very unlikely situation where there could be an impact on the tax levy. And that's when there is a retained earnings deficit. Now, that doesn't mean an annual operating loss in 1 year. It basically means that something would have happened that would wipe out this $5 million that's being put aside in a savings account for the water system, plus any other surpluses that would have occurred. And in that unlikely event, the town would need to fund the retained earnings deficit, presumably by bonding. Now, why do I say it's rather improbable that something like this would happen? Well, with local rate setting, you'd have the Board of Selectmen as water commissioners, or whatever other governance vehicle comes down the road, looking at the numbers on a regular basis. And retained earnings deficits don't just come into existence overnight. They could be anticipated. I mean, if operational costs are exceeding expected revenues, it's time for a rate increase. And that's a rate increase not of taxes, but of water rates. Just as if Aquarian's operational costs increased, it would be looking for a rate increase. So I think that's really what I want to say about the enterprise fund, and happy to address questions.
Did I understand correctly that in the unlikely event that there was a necessity to borrow, that would be recouped in future rate paying?
I should have said that, thank you. So if, in the event that there was a need for the town to take care of a retained, if I've got this getting late at night, retained earnings deficit, that would be recouped in the following year out of the enterprise fund, repaying the town. So it would be a very short-term impact on the tax levy, if any. Thank you, Don.
Questions from my colleagues? Dave?
I'm curious, this is a question that a citizen raised with me, and I'm just wondering, the specificity in the recommended motion, literally down to the dollar, what happens if we can almost be certain that it won't be precisely the numbers that we're voting? What are the impacts, if any, of when the dust settles on the year, that the numbers are different?
I've been advised that within an enterprise fund, just as the town does intra-departmental transfers, that these funds can move from one account to another.
Okay.
So that within the enterprise fund, there's essentially complete flexibility in terms of putting the money where the dollars need to be.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And Bob, also, is that, I'm just thinking about, like, for the country club and the existing enterprise fund that we have, it's a recommendation to town meeting, right? The ultimate number in Article 6, I don't know if, because I've been told in the past that, like in particular for the country club, that's a recommendation and that they'll only spend what they can based on the revenues that they collect.
My memory with Article 6 is it's an actual budget that's voted on with the
But I'm talking about the enterprise fund that's within Article 6.
with the caveat that it is to be paid for out of the enterprise.
I believe Libby's correct that the recommendation, if said this water commit, so I believe that Libby's correct that this, for the enterprise fund, the town meeting would vote a recommended budget, and then the water commissioners, whoever they were, would be adopting the budget. I'll ask the selectmen if that's their understanding as well, or council.
The selectmen for this year have already adopted that as their budget for the coming fiscal year. So that would be the budget approved at town meeting this year. Next spring, same cycle, the Board of Selectmen acting as the Water Commissioners would then adopt a budget for next year. But that is the recommended budget that was adopted for this year already.
So in future years, though, so the selectmen would adopt a budget before town meeting, and then the water commissioners.
Enterprise funds have to have their budget submitted by March 1st of each year. So the budget gets submitted by March 1st, it's then included in the warrant at town meeting, and then that budget is ultimately passed by town meeting.
Yeah, the enterprise fund statute requires town meeting approval of the budget.
Correct. After it's been submitted by March 1st deadline.
Okay.
So ultimately, it's town meeting that approves the budget, same with any other budget in the town.
Right, I guess the distinguishing point I was just trying to mention is that it's a recommended, so we know this was already voted by the date. I'm just saying that for any of the enterprise funds that we have in Article 6 are recommendations, and that ultimately what actually will come in and go out, or really what goes out, will depend on what comes in. I mean, that's just the
Right, you have to come up with
reality.
what your estimated revenues and
Yeah.
expenses are going to be for
Yeah.
the year. And then there was the question about the transfers. There's a statute that allows the selectmen and the advisory committee at the end of each calendar year, each fiscal year, to make transfers within those line items within the budget. So if you go over in expenses or capital or something, you can move those line items around at the end of the year. But that happens already for all other line items in the budget, so no different.
Yeah, so I think any budget questions would have to come up during the time when they come to AdCom or the selectmen, because it's just one line item in Article 6. So the questions about the budget really have to come up during our normal, because it's just one line item on there.
Right, in this case, they did not choose to do one line item, they were a little bit more elaborate. I think the country club is a single line item, so there's a difference between the two.
Additional questions from my colleagues? Nancy?
Can you remind me how the pilot is calculated? Or determined, I guess.
My memory is it's basically the same amount that Aquarian would have paid to the town. So that this is,
Based on our tax rates?
I don't know that I can speak to every year. Mr. Asher's indicating that.
Yes, it would.
It is?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, John Asher, 5 Common Street. We used as a starting point Aquarion's tax payments to all of the municipalities, actually 5 of them, and we escalated, as we escalate all the costs in the model, by 3% a year, which is actually more than the property taxes will actually increase.
So it's not just leftover, it is a calculation.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions from my colleagues?
And just actually, so you know, Nancy, that was a question that came up from a subcommittee meeting, and they actually went back and confirmed with the town that those were actually the bills, because there was a discrepancy between whether it was from the DPU, the original model had it from the 2012 case, and then grew by 3%, but then the rate case from this October set it, now we had the 28, the rate case then for that year, so then then it went from there, so I can confirm that we
Okay.
tightened that up.
I'm sure you did. Thank you.
Or just to make sure we were on the same page, I should say.
Thanks, Libby.
Additional questions from my colleagues? Questions or comments from the audience on the enterprise fund? Yes, sir.
Richard Booth, Nantasket Ave, Hull. Just a clarification. The predicate was there, if a retained earnings deficit occurred, the town would need to fund the deficit probably by bonding. My question is, retained earning deficit in what account? In the enterprise fund account or in the town financial
Yes,
account?
if there's a retained deficit, earnings deficit in the enterprise fund itself.
Okay.
And probably not by bonding. If there were borrowing, I'd expect it would be short-term.
Okay.
Additional questions or comments from the audience on this one? I can't even say moving on to PP.
We just did. Speaking of which, does anyone need a bio break?
This is Libby.
Yes. Okay, so, slide this over. So Article PP. This is for the transition costs, and I think as I mentioned earlier, this transition period will look slightly different than what Bob had. So, Bob, when you went through this, did you go through the whole question or not really? You just explained it?
I
Just summarize.
gave
Yeah,
the
okay.
executive summary.
Gives crisp descriptions.
He does. He does.
Evan's
Do
getting
we
tired.
Did we have the timer on him? I'm going to do this, and we're going to be out of here by 11. Okay. So this article is to capture the gap between the enterprise fund needing the money and when they have it. So I will just read this because it's a much simpler way to do it. So if the town votes to purchase the water systems, Aquarian Service Area A, there will be a transition period from town meeting vote to the debt issuance of approximately $112 million. The duration of this period is unique to each municipality that depends on the completion of certain tasks as well as the degree of cooperation between Aquarian and the town. So during the transition period, the parties have certain responsibilities. Aquarian will continue to operate the water system in accordance with their legal good husbandry obligation that includes an orderly transfer of purchased assets to the town, and no large capital investments would be made during this time. The town will establish the selectmen as water commissioners, hire a water superintendent, issue a request for proposal, and hire a water system operator and capital vendor, prepare documents for the bond issuance, establish a transition and evaluation committee and citizens advisory board, and work with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection to complete the regulatory approval. The cost to be incurred during the transition period, based on the previous article we just went over, the year one enterprise fund budget, include a portion of the following expenses. And these come from a couple of different categories from the previous article. So it is salary and benefits for the water superintendent of $200,000, outsourced transition costs of $165,000, and other transaction costs of $150,000. So just to reiterate, it is a portion of those three categories. Since the water company won't have access to funds until the financial transaction is complete, this article requests the town advance the water enterprise fund an amount not in excess of $250,000 in order to commence transition activities. Any funds provided by the town for this purpose will be reimbursed upon the initial debt issuance. And again, this article, as the previous two, are all subject to approval of Article MM, the main one, and the select, I don't know if we're going through the votes, but anyway. So that's a summary of it.
Thank you. Questions from my colleagues for Libby on this article? George?
I'm just curious as to why the duration of the transition period is different for each of the communities.
George is just asking why the duration is different in each of the two communities, and I think that's something that council has often responded to that question.
The duration is dependent on a number of factors, including it's during the good husbandry period, and so the factors are such things as, land has to be transferred, licenses have to be transferred, vehicles have to be transferred, work has to be done with the DEP, the bonding has to occur, and part of it's going to depend on a lot of factors, including, as was mentioned, cooperation from Aquarian. So there's no way to say, oh, it's going to be exactly so long. It's going to be a flexible time period, and the courts look at it as that period of time where both parties are supposed to cooperate and just get it done. That's the idea of the transition period.
All right, am I reading it incorrectly then, where it says for each town, the transition period would be different for Hingham versus Cohasset versus Hull?
No.
So I'm reading it wrong?
Yeah, in
Gotcha.
different cases.
Different, I guess, purchases of water systems would be different.
Thank you.
But no, this would all, Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset are all in the same boat. It's one system. There's only one system being purchased.
Correct.
Maybe the author and
Need
the
to
editor
correct.
could note that as a clarification. Additional questions from my colleagues? Questions from the audience on this article?
Oh, I see how you read it.
Mr. O'Hare?
Yeah. I'm the editor, so that's what.
Jim O'Hare, 11 Heron Way. I don't mean this as a hostile question, but the term large capital transaction, which has come up, what's the definition of a large capital transaction? Is that simply ongoing maintenance, or is that something like acquisition of a piece of land? I just don't know the answer to that term, and it's come up both in this meeting and a number of other meetings. I'm sure council has probably addressed that. What is a large capital transaction in that transition period? Thank you.
Anybody prepared to address that?
Is this question something specific for the article? Because I know the one thing I mentioned about was completion of the financial transaction, but I didn't say capital.
It says no large capital investments.
Oh, is that the portion that you're asking about? The sentence that said that no large capital investment would be made during this time?
Yes.
That's, again, probably
It's simply a definition, not, it's come up before.
I believe it's during the good husbandry period but I'll let council confirm.
What would be an example of that? That's really the
Yeah.
genesis of the question.
Okay.
I believe, Louis, what you probably are referring to, and that's what you were just talking to, it's during the good husbandry period.
Yep.
And an example, if indeed during the good husbandry period where the town now would own the system, but Aquarian would still be running it, let's say, for example, they decided to put in a new main across all of Main Street. That would be a large capital expenditure, and unless the town agreed with it, they would not be allowed to do it. And so the whole purpose of the good husbandry is to operate the system, make sure that you transfer an operating valid system, you have the licenses, you have the insurance in place, but you don't start brand new big projects unless the town wants you to, in which case you would work cooperatively. If you don't agree, then, if necessary, you could deal with it in the appropriate forum, but that's what's meant.
Sure, quickly.
Bob, and how would that reflect on the amount that would be transferred or retained in the enterprise fund? In other words, would capital investment cease during that period of time? Thanks. In other words, I think the $5 million or 4.8 or 6, I think it was originally, I thought, is that accumulated because there would not be any during this period of time in transition, no significant capital investments or improvements to the existing system?
Bob, do you want me to cover the numbers thing? I think that the purchase price gets rolled forward for any of those, whether it's capital expenditures or whatever that Aquarian puts into the system, and then once no, is that not right? And once, let me just finish and then we can say, then during the good husbandry period is where there has to be mutual agreement, but I would think, but I'll defer to whoever did the calculation for the roll forward of the purchase price.
Who's on first? What's on second?
I think, I was going to say, I was going to check with the finance folks. So to the extent it's a finance question about exactly when, I'm not sure about that. I defer to them. I think what it's saying is during the good husbandry period, there typically is not any large projects that are started. If there's one that's already, you're in the middle of it, yes, you complete it. I mean, it's not like, the water company, in other words, during the good husbandry period, I guess I'll try to use this better. Nothing stops. It's not like everything stops at the vote of the town meeting and everything has to be done again. Your water company, the idea is whatever's going on needs to continue. But the idea is don't start something brand new. So I don't know if that helps at all.
The community.
Correct.
To the buyer.
Exactly.
Because you would want the town to be or you'd want the new owner to be the one making that decision.
Correct. You've
not
gone
the person who's selling.
Correct. You've gone from an owner to now you're almost like a tenant.
Yeah.
That-
Okay.
Purchase price taking effect on 4/22.
Well, I don't think that was the question. It was about whether anything was spent.
Sure, because the rates include depreciation, which is spent on capital.
Does
I was gonna
someone
say,
else?
I'll
need
let
to-
somebody else answer the financial piece of that.
During the period, at least as I understand good husbandry, during that period of good husbandry, Aquarian is continuing to operate the system. They're receiving money from ratepayers. The rates include the cost of depreciation, which funds capital investment. So the normal capital flow is going to occur during the course of the good husbandry period. But as has been stated a couple of times, the beginning of large new projects, for example, MRAM projects that are over and above the normal capital flow that's built into the rates, wouldn't be started without the agreement of the town.
Mr. Walsh.
So let me. You do that. I think it's just take that.
I think I can shed some light on this because although I'm not an attorney, I've actually operated a system under good husbandry. I've testified in court on good husbandry.
So tell us.
So I'm very familiar. Oh, John Walsh, Vice President of Operations, sorry. Sorry. So, first of all, and I would recommend that Attorney Ryan speak to, unfortunately, our attorney on this issue has had to leave because he's got an early morning flight. I'd recommend you speak to our attorney. The town does not own the system as of April 23rd. If you get a yes vote on April 22nd, Aquarian continues to own the system until the closing on the system. Good husbandry means that the company is restricted to spending capital that is necessary to maintain the system appropriately for the customers. The exact legal language I don't exactly remember, but Aquarian is versed in this because we lived through 4 years of good husbandry in another system. And everything that we did during those 4 years ended up being accepted by a court as appropriate good husbandry.
Thank you, sir. Additional,
You just identify the system first.
It was the Oxford system.
Carrie?
Unfortunately, just another example of the town and Aquarian don't seem to able to agree on some things. The town does own the system at the time. If the town meeting votes to take the system under the statute, the 1879 statute, we own the system then. The courts are crystal clear on that. That's not an issue that's unclear. At the time of the vote, if it's a 2/3 vote affirmatively, that is the purchase of the system. All right?
Thank you, sir. I don't want to have an argument about this tonight. Go ahead.
As counsel to Aquarian, we disagree. The analogy is you sign to purchase, and the town is committed to purchasing, like we would commit when we sign a purchase and sale agreement for a house. But many people don't close on that purchase. And this gets to why the town needs opinions that it can get to its financing. It can get its mechanic for actually taking ownership. The town will be committed to buy. Good husbandry continues. Aquarian can do no harm. But the cases that I've read are unequivocally clear. Title only transfers at the closing, and that's when there's an ownership and a payment of the funds. And we can take the rest of it offline, but Aquarian has a different view. Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Additional questions? Ted?
I wouldn't dare get in between two attorneys battling it out over the ownership of a water company.
Especially not in front of the advisory committee.
Exactly.
I think it's 11:06.
Okay, Ted.
All right. You guys are amazing, and the amount of work that you do at this time of year is very appreciated by the people of the town of Hingham, I'm sure. So I just want to thank the selectmen for their work on this. I did vote for each one of you. So, and thank the Water Company Acquisition Committee for their work. I don't know any of them very well, but I know they're very hardworking men. So, Suzanne Bump, state auditor, says there's $7 billion in infrastructure deficits in the state of Mass. And we have spent $1.5 million to get to this day. I'm here to deliver a letter from a group of us who became concerned that the water company feasibility study, which had been approved at town meeting in 2012, had fallen by the wayside. In 2013, we didn't hear much about it, but a few months after town meeting, we were in litigation. So, over the years, due to a growing concern that the purchase of the water company was being fast-tracked without the Board of Selectmen properly vetting its financial governance and operational components, several of us began holding regular meetings. We created a website and a Facebook page, and we've written letters to the editor and letters to friends, and we've been engaged at almost every public meeting that has been held on the subject. To date, the financial aspect of this proposal has been scrutinized by individuals, committees, and peer reviewers. After much analysis by an independent third party, it became clear that the model put forward by the selectmen, the original model put forward by the selectmen, was replete with inaccuracies. The selectmen's proposed transition plan, speaking to this article, the selectmen's proposed transition plan is seriously lacking in substance and specificity. It's not an overstatement to say that the plan is a recipe for disaster. Without a viable transition plan, there's a tremendous degree of uncertainty. We've heard about many issues at various meetings we've attended. Without a timeline with milestones carefully laid out, you know, it will take years. It could take years, we just heard. Even more concerning is the fact that the selectmen have said that they would force Aquarian to operate the system with their hands tied behind their backs, and they would do this for an indefinite amount of time. In practical terms, this means Aquarian wouldn't be allowed to replace water mains or invest in infrastructure for 6 months, a year, 2 years. We have no idea. because we didn't include a sunset clause in the article. We're relying on that good husbandry standard. However, the standard is limited in scope and it's open to interpretation. Because of this, we respectfully suggest that it's critical for the advisory committee to seek confirmation from the selectmen on a number of items prior to taking a vote on the proposed water company acquisition articles. We've taken the liberty of identifying the ones we find to be most relevant and pressing. All of them have been discussed openly in public meetings, but none have yet to be resolved. The selectmen should provide the advisory with a prospectus that outlines the overall scope and scale of the transition with detailed descriptions of responsibilities, a timeline that contains deadlines, and a sunset clause. I'm gonna try to, I don't see those colored tiles going up yet, but a couple of things before I finish. We would like, number one, this is, we're delivering a petition here, a copy to Donna. We know that the moderator should receive this petition to move these articles up to early in the night so that we're able to have a nice conversation about it before voting. We're hoping that he will see that, seeing that this meeting has gone on for 3.5 hours, going on 4, it's probably a good idea. We'd also draw the advisory committee's attention to a need for a secret ballot. Our success as a town is always dependent upon inclusive, accessible, respectful, constructive, and purposeful dialogue, otherwise known as the Hingham Way. However, in today's climate, the conversation around the water company has become divisive. We find that residents who ask town officials questions or share differing opinions are met with disdain or attack. We see neighbor pitted against neighbor on social media, and a recent letter to the editor is the latest example of a baseless smear campaign waged against our water company. We're a long way off from the Hingham Way, and it will be to our detriment. Behavior on social media is particularly beyond crazy, as I would call it. It's astonishing that certain individuals, including elected officials, those running for office, and those in appointed positions, would publicly represent our town that way. Our group and its members are regularly attacked on a particular Hingham page called the Discussion Board, on our own page called Keep Aquarian, and through private messages to our page. These attacks are well orchestrated and are intended to bully opposing voices into silence. So, I won't go on about that. This issue is far too important. People should feel comfortable expressing themselves and absolutely should be able to vote the way they feel compelled to vote. Therefore, we insist that a fair and honest outcome can only be guaranteed by careful management of town meeting. And with that, I will leave you with this paperwork.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
If you leave that with Sue, she'll get it to me.
That's
Okay?
great. I appreciate it. The box is for you, and these can go to each of the
Okay,
advisory
thank you.
committee. Thank you.
Other comments from the public on this warrant article? Okay, we wrap up our discussion for the evening. For members of the public who may have wanted to speak and didn't, I hope there aren't any, but if you have any questions or comments that you wish to issue after the fact, I would direct you to the AdCom email address, which is advisorycommittee@hingham.ma.gov. That's advisorycommittee@hingham-ma.gov. We do share comments on public issues that come in through that address with all advisory committee members. More importantly, I would like to check with my advisory committee colleagues. Do any of you have questions or areas where you feel as though you need additional information before you would be prepared to vote, as is our plan on Wednesday? I'm looking at this side of the table. Is anybody in need of additional information before Wednesday? Should you wake up tomorrow with something that needs additional information, please direct it to Victor, who has already gotten me several answers to questions where I needed some help. In the interests of the hour, we are going to defer any liaison updates, and under Advisory Committee housekeeping, I would just remind everyone that our next meeting is this Wednesday on the 20th, when we expect to vote. We hope to vote Article D. We expect to vote Article D, and we expect to vote the 4 water company articles. With that, a motion to adjourn is in order?
So moved.
A second? How come you didn't make it? Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time and attention.